All right, good evening, guys. Welcome back to Science of Diving. Again, Benjamin Hadfield teaching. Will be teaching today, and I am an instructor trainer in this as well. So, we covered a lot of stuff last night. Let's just kind of go through and do a kind of a brief review of everything we covered last night. Overall, we kind of covered the basic idea of what physics are and what they do when a tank is empty. One of the questions we kind of figured out is if we took a tank empty that was empty at 1 ATA. We took it to 16,000 feet. What would the ATA be at 16,000 feet, Adam?
The 16, so the ETA of a tank.
The ATA. Huh? What would the atmospheric pressure be at 16,000 feet? It's one full bar at 1 atmosphere at 0 foot sea level. There we go. At sea level. At 16,000 feet, how many ATA is it?
Is it still just, I actually don't know how. Above water doesn't affect it the same as below water.
Well, it does because we have less atmospheric pressure, so we have a reduction in atmospheric pressure. So, for example, Adam, we're sitting at 5,000 foot elevation, which means we're at 0.84 atmospheres. So we're 16% less than what we'd be atmospheric pressure wise than at sea level. So at 16,000 feet, that's a magic number for us. We remember that that's half an ATA. So it's 0.5 ATA. And Megan got this one yesterday, so I decided to give it to you. So just remember that a scuba cylinder is considered empty at the surface when the pressure reaches 1 ATA, right? Where the interior and the exterior are at equilibrium.
Right.
So we take that same empty cylinder to an altitude of 16,000 feet. That's
Right.
half an ATA. We open that valve and air will flow out because the pressure decreased, allowing the volume to increase until that cylinder is able to equalize.
Right.
Make sense?
Yeah. I just didn't know the number. So 0.84.
Absolutely. Now, if I were you guys and I was getting ready to go on a dive and I wanted to know what my best mix is, where can I find a easy to use table for best mix for nitrox?
On SSI?
On the SSI app, absolutely. And it's even called best mix. How about my mod? Is there an easy way to do that math or just to find a table for that?
Yeah.
Someplace.
Absolutely. We also talked a little bit about, do you guys remember what the partial pressure of nitrogen was when it starts to become dangerous and create a narcotic effect?
The partial pressure of nitrogen.
It's 2.37, I believe.
Ding, ding, ding. Look at you go. Woo! Got the smart girl today.
Mm-hmm.
Right on. Okay. And then we went through and we talked a lot about the laws, and I kind of gave you guys the cheat sheet on that, so it definitely helps out. But talk to me, Megan, a little bit about Henry's law. What did you learn about Henry's law? What is that kind of controlling, and why do we want to know that?
Isn't Henry's law when how the gas dissolves in liquid or something like that?
It's exactly right. Absolutely. And there's one other aspect of it that we definitely need to take into consideration. What was that? There's one aspect of that, not just the agitation, but
temperature.
Temperature, exactly. Adam, why would a cold gas be of concern to us versus a warm gas, or be more concerned?
Well, it affects the pressures and the temperature. The temperatures affect the pressures as far as when you're underwater and hot, and you get more. But if you're under cold, it compresses and it's less.
Absolutely. The other thing to be aware of as a cold water diver that cold gas absorbs into a liquid faster and into our tissue compartments faster as well. So that's absolutely right. You got half of it and just brought the other half in. So good job. You guys were listening yesterday, which definitely helps. And then we had the opportunity. I can certainly go into detail about buoyancy, but I feel like the Cartesian diver is a better expression of that. So I kind of leave it there for the Cartesian diver to kind of understand that. We also talked a little bit about how you calculate your SAC rate. And I definitely encourage you guys, take a date night tomorrow night or Friday night and do the SAC rate calculation. And please, please, please take pictures of you guys cuddling up on the couch with your masks and regulators in and taking your calculations. Remember, it's pretty easy. Mark the amount of gas at the beginning of your show, count the time, mark the gas at the end of the show and how much time it was, and divide. Do that 3 times because that will give you your basic sack rate. Now, to kind of refill in on sack rate, just so we know, once we get our idea that we know that we're going through, we'll say 20 psi per minute. We'll just do it at psi for right now, and then we'll talk about the liters conversion in a little bit. So, Megan, if I know at the surface I go through 20 psi a minute, how many psi per minute would I go through at 66 feet?
Double that.
66 feet.
Oh, 60 feet. Oh, I don't know.
66 feet's 3 atmospheres.
So 3 times.
Mm-hmm.
So at 2 atmospheres, it's 2 times. At 3 atmospheres, it's 3 times. At 4 atmospheres, it's going to be 4 times. So if we know it so easily enough, I know that if I go through 20 psi per minute on the surface, and that's based upon the fact that I'm diving the same cylinder as I did my psi test in as well, that I know that all of a sudden I'm going to go through 60 psi a minute at 66 feet, right? There's only one other key factor in that sack rate that I really need to really make sure I take into account. What is that, Adam?
Is it the RMV part?
Well, the RMV is the whole thing. That's the work of breathing, the respiratory minute value.
What's the question? Sorry.
That's absolutely. So let's think about it like this. If I were to go to Walmart and push a cart around Walmart, would I go through more or less gas than if I went down to Idaho Falls track and ran with a 50-pound ruck on my back?
Yeah, you're going to use more when you're exercising harder. So
absolutely. So the work of it, right?
Yeah, it's your times factor that you were showing us last night.
Absolutely. So the effort factor. So we generally think about that. A nice warm Caribbean dive, doing a drift, floating along, looking at pretty fish. You know, we think about a 1.1 to 1.5 work factor, right? As we start getting a little heavier and a little harder, we're carrying a bigger tank, maybe multiple tanks, or a dry suit, cold water. We're working against a current, trying to hold a camera. We're in the deep, our mind's going off. We're a little scared, maybe. We go to a much higher work factor. And so that's one of the things you start to, as you go through this process of monitoring, your sack rate won't change, but what will change, the variable for you will really be the work factor involved in that. How hard was this dive? And there's 2 parts that go into that, right? There's the physical work of carrying freaking tanks and a dry suit and cold water, the physical aspect of that. But there's also the mind factor that we need to take into account as well. That's huge. A good example of that is I was doing a dive, I don't know, about 5-6 years ago out at Ryrie by myself. I was, kicking along at 108 feet. And all of a sudden, my light went off and something grabbed the regulator out of my mouth at the exact same time. Because we all know problems come in 2s, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes 3s. And so, like any good instructor or good diver that I practice, no big deal. I tried to pull on my regulator. It wouldn't come. I reached down, found my safety second, cleared it, found my spare light and on my GoPro and looked at my light and was able to get my light back on because I just hadn't turned the bezel enough and it clicked right back on. I was able to look over, find that my regulator got pulled out by a tree branch. I gently took it out, took my safety second out, put my primary back in, breathed it off. Everything was good to go. Put my spare light away and continued on my journey. The whole thing probably took, and this is no bullshit, probably took 2 minutes at best. I think on the outside. But if you watch the sack rate on my nice little computer, because it carried it, I was kicking along at about 12 to 14 psi per minute on that computer. When that happened, it went from 12 to 14 psi a minute to 35 psi per minute. Mm-hmm. Now, what had changed was between the ears. So I want you to take into account that as you think about these dives and you write these in your logs, it's a really good idea to talk about in your log, what was your mental state? Was there a fear point in that dive? And I can tell you absolutely, I've had fear points in dives. I've done some really big dives, really deep, where I started getting some pretty high gas densities, where I started to get that gloom and doom. Oh my God, I'm going to die and everybody in the world's going to die and the world's coming to an end and zombies are going to kill us, right? I've absolutely had that dive, right? And so we put that kind of stuff down. I was scared, or there was a very heavy current. I was diving Firehole River and I got to the current. I just couldn't, and I saw the right. Put that stuff in your dive log. It's just to your advantage to start recording that kind of stuff so you can start building a statistic along. And maybe this is partially because I've lived in a world of stats and numbers for a really long time, and so that's how everybody thinks I make my money in selling crap or just talking. Where I make my money is understanding the numbers behind stuff. Because when I had a meeting the other day with some people and they were trying to give me some BS stuff, and I looked them straight in the eye and I says, well, I've got the numbers right here and they don't support your answer. And it shut them right up, right? So that's kind of the world I live in, and I've always lived in, is this world of understanding the numbers behind. And so the same thing with diving. If you can understand the numbers behind what's going on, you can make a more predictive focus on what's going to happen in the future. So more numbers, better data, better prediction of the future, right? So we know this as we go along. One of the things that Nikki and I know, that 58% of dive maladies are cardiac related. We have an AED in the truck. The stats don't lie, and we know that at some point, knock on wood, we're going to have to deal with a cardiac emergency. The best way to deal with a cardiac emergency is be prepared for it, right? And so that's why we keep an AED in the car. Yeah, and it costs us like $3,500, but that's okay. I would rather have it. And you know the good thing about an AED is you get one use out of it. You get one full set. Once you've got that person back to life or dead or whatever happens, when you're done with that whole cycle of clear, all that fun stuff, you throw the AED away and you get a new one.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I didn't know that until after I bought one. They're not reusable. You don't get, and I guess maybe if you're a paramedic and you spend $20,000 on one, maybe they're reusable. I don't know. But the one I bought, I found out was not reusable. You literally set it back in and for a measly $2,000 or replace the battery and reset it up for you, and you get basically a new AED. So interesting things. So as you got to go through this, thinking about your SAC rate and preparing for your dives, make sure you're taking that time to look back and understand your previous dives, because if you can understand your previous dives, you can make better decisions on what your future dives will be. And you've both expressed that, well, I should say 1.5 of you have expressed an interest in moving towards those bigger dives with 2 tanks, 3 tanks, 4 tanks, right? And that's very exciting. It's very fun. But the farther you move down this road, the more prepared and the more that dive plan and that past history really comes into play. So that's what we're really kind of talking about. You guys have done amazing. We covered a lot of stuff in a very short amount of time yesterday, so I was really excited. So tonight, we're going to talk about energy in the water. We're going to talk a little bit about light, refraction, diffusion, turbidity, absorption. We'll talk a little about sound, heat, the conduction, convection, and radiation.
Okay.
Say that 5 times fast.
Great.
Absolutely. Joke of the day, by the way, the one I liked today was, just when you thought vegetables couldn't call, onions ring. So there's my bad joke of the day. Nikki didn't get it. I sent it over to her. She says, you don't like onion rings. I'm like, that's not the point. So one of the things we need to be aware of is we kind of looking at water and understand the physics of outside of us, is objects don't always appear the same in underwater environment as they do on land. So then there's 4 major factors that we need to understand and have at least a character understanding of how these work and how they influence the change of what we see. Now, we've all been out to the river and we've seen the fish that looks like it's over there, but it's actually over here. Why is that?
So the refraction, is that? So sorry.
That's exactly right. Refraction.
Thought so.
So it's refracting light in a different way. So light travels at about 1.33 times faster through the water as well. And the speed changes causes the light rays to actually bend as the light speeds up, as it enters the water or enters your mask. So we need to be aware of that. It's traveling and bending as it's moving through the mask. And one of the things that this does for us, and every guy loves, is that everything looks 33% bigger. We love this. I mean, our hands are bigger. The fish I saw was this big. I swear to God, it was this big. And Megan pulls it out on her fishing line. Adam, it was really like this. So that's the truth of the matter. The only reason I know that the lake trout I saw 2 weeks ago in Bear Lake was at least 2.5 feet is I got close enough to put my arm up next to him, and he was ahead of my arm and behind my elbow. So,
Yeah.
and he was big fat. And if I had had a spear, I would be eating trout right now. But so we have to do those kind of things because we have that magnification, right? Things look 33% closer and 33% bigger as well. The next thing we kind of deal with is diffusion. And this is when light enters the water and the rays are broken up and scattered. Now, the main effect of diffusion is less light at depth. Pretty simple fact, right? And as we start talking about diffusion, we start getting into Roy G. Biv. We talked about that a lot in open water. But that's where, as light is diffused through the water, at 15 feet, we lose our reds. At about 25 feet, we start losing our oranges, and then our yellows, and so on through, so on. And we can thank diffusion for that because it blocks and stops the light rays. But as we know at Ryrie, it also stops the light completely at some point. Having
that.
Absolutely. So the other thing we know very well from Ryrie is turbidity. Particles suspended in the water cause like algae blooms, plankton, pollution, silt, things like that. It's funny, Nikki and I did a big dive in Florida 3 years ago. I'm going to say 3 or 4 years ago. We were doing 150, 165, something like that. And we jumped, and the only boat we could get to go out was the boat from the shop. And they didn't want to go out because they only had 40 feet of viz. We're like, we're psyched at 40 feet of viz. But we got down and it started getting dark. And the reason was they jumped Lake Okeechobee and they had all this red tide coming through. So we had to dive through the red tide to get to the depth, which was still was fine for us. We still had 40 feet of viz. We still saw coral. We still saw plenty of fish. But there's a lot of different things. And that was just another type of algae. It was a red algae. But you can also get plankton and pollutants as well in the water. And so that's our turbidity. The last piece we talk about is absorption. And this is the other half of diffusion. And interestingly enough, diffusion causes part of a reason for us to lose the light. Absorption is the other half of why we lose the light and the color. So as we go deeper in depths, colors change. The visible light spectrum gradiates through red, orange, yellow, gray, right? Through that, it shortens the wavelength. So it's diffusing, won't let the light through, but it also absorbs it too. So we get it in two directions as we go through. So those are a couple of the big key things that we kind of deal with as we're dealing with light and water as we kind of go through. Other things that cause turbidity as well, wind hitting sand and causing sand and sediment to kick up from the bottom. We've dealt with that quite a bit, especially at Ryrie, right? We've all been out there during a windy time, and it's been like, oh, yay. Got to get down to 100 feet and before I get any kind of visibility. Then it's just going to be another night dive. Yay! So, and that's one of the reasons that I like deep diving at Ryrie is because that's where the clarity comes. And interestingly enough, if you get to 135 feet at 140 feet at Ryrie, it's pitch black, but there's a really cool modeling of the algae on the bottom. It almost looks like marble until you touch it and you find it's kind of soft, but it's got this really neat marbling to it. It's one of my favorite things. And you get down there and you'll see a few crawdads now and again. You'll see a few perch, not a lot, but it's really interesting is because you'll see a rock pop up and this marbling of the algae on the bottom out there as well. So it's one of the reasons I like it out there.
That's kind of cool. I was told somewhere, and I want to find it, but supposedly there's like an old town ruins or house ruins at the bottom of Palisades somewhere.
I've heard that same thing, but I've also seen Palisades at 2% full, and I've never seen them either from that. So,
yeah,
but I do know.
I was told that they could start seeing it when it's down at 2%. So I haven't seen it because I didn't know where to look for it.
Yeah, I've driven past there. I've never seen it either, but I've got a good one for you. So there's a reservoir just outside of Helena. I'm blanking on that. Helena, Montana. So just to the east of, and I want to say it's Canyon Ferry Reservoir. What happened is in 1904 they decided to build a new dam, and so they literally, being in 1904, they said, "Okay, we're building a new dam. We'll have it ready in about a year. So if you live here, you got to get your butt out." And so they kicked everybody out, and there was a smaller, older dam, and so they filled up this valley, and they filled up the old past the old dam. So now, if you know the right people, there's some lines that they can show you how to get to, and you can take the lines and you go down to the old dam, which is about 110 feet, and you can feel the bricks in the wall. But there's also the old pump house and a Model T down there as well that you can go down and check out. And the visibility at that point at the 100, 110 feet is supposed to be pretty decent. But getting out there is a trick because you have to use a line or you'll never find it. So that's not all that far. I think Helen is what, 4 hours from here? 3 hours? Something like that?
Sure. I'm sure I've drove through it, but I'm not exactly sure where it's at.
Helena, Montana. It's pretty. I've been there a few times. It's definitely it's a cool town, and Old Town Helena is really pretty. It's just really, really one of my favorite places. Very beautiful, and I'm just looking it up real quick. But yeah, if you guys are ever interested in doing that, let me know. I know some people that it's 4 hours and 12 minutes from here, so that would love to take us and show us that as well. So. Some other things to be aware of. How about sound? Is sound, Megan, travel faster or slower underwater?
Faster.
Absolutely. How much faster?
4 times.
Absolutely. The dense medium of the air allows sound to travel faster. So sound travels a bit faster in saltwater than fresh. And the faster rate of sound has several effects on the diver. Now, it's interesting. One of the things, because of that, our brain is programmed for the current sound speed through air, right? And with our 2 ears, we're able to say, okay, the sound's coming from over there, or it's coming from over there, based upon having 2 ears and the speed of travel that our brain has been programmed to. The challenge with that is with it traveling 4 times faster underwater, is it travels actually too fast for our brain to process and say, oh, there, or there, or there. And so it's one of the reasons you'll hear a boat, but you can't always figure out where the boat's at. So it's one of the things to be aware of, and perceiving. So it perceives that all the sound is going to be all around you. And that's because of your brain programming, unfortunately. But it's definitely interesting. And some of the interesting things that cause sound underwater, other than me banging on my tank, trying to get somebody's attention, right? Rain. I love the sound of rain underwater, or hail. Nikki and I did one of our last dives last year in Yellowstone. I dropped on one spire and she had dropped on was going to drop on a different spire. We were going to run a line between the two so we could find them again, right? And not for us, but so other divers could find them. Anyway, I dropped down, found the spire, swam over, and got her. And it was dark. It was getting ready to hail, and it rained. It started raining. We dropped down to 45, 50 feet, and it was amazing. It turned out it hailed about 2 inches. But it sounded like the fury of God was going on above us. It was one of my favorite sounds I have heard. I've heard lightning underwater. That's definitely not a fun one. You kind of worry about that one a little bit. Electricity and water, all that. So storms are a good one. Cracking ice. Cracking ice is an interesting one. You'll hear it, and it's usually when the ice is a little thinner, but you'll definitely hear that. One of my favorite dives in Maui was we did a scooter dive off the shore about a mile, and we came up to this reef that nobody gets to dive. And I was with a friend that had a lot of experience on the reef, so we put our scooters down. And at one point, he says, "You," and in other words, stop breathing. And then he said, "Listen." And as we were on this reef, you could hear the fish talking. And they were actually pretty loud about it as we held our breath and everything else. So try that sometime. Next time you go on a reef, take the time and just listen. It's pretty impressive how much the marine life will actually talk to you as well. In Yellowstone, one of our favorites, there's a deco stop we like to do over in Mary Bay, where there's carbon dioxide bubbles coming from out of the rocks. And it sounds like you're in a fish tank. That's a neat one. Surface waves. I haven't heard a ton of those, but I've heard enough of them that they're definitely interesting. I've got a really cool video of whale songs for about a mile off the shore. We were doing a dive, and you could hear, whoa, whoa, whoa. It was very, very, very like a movie. I was very surprised how clear and nice they sounded, right? Other things, I've never heard an earthquake underwater, and I'm pretty okay with that. Hydrothermal vents definitely make an interesting sound. We've all heard boats. One of my computers uses sonar for its pods. And when with the first version of it, when I wouldn't wear a hood, I could actually hear the sonar. make this ping sound. And sometimes with that other pod, I can still hear it in the pool. I've never heard a snowmobile underwater, but those are definitely, there's a lot of different things that cause and make sounds, right? Seismic shifts is another one as well. So as we kind of be aware of that, sound is definitely an interesting thing, and it lets us know what's kind of going on around us. Other thing we need to be aware of in the world around us in physics is heat loss. Megan, how much faster do we lose heat in water versus air?
25 times.
Ding, ding, ding. You are so good at this. So cold water definitely increases the rate of heat loss considerably. And insulation layers are how we stay warm. And you guys are dry suit divers, so we get a pretty good understanding of that. But there's a couple key things to be aware of in that as well. So as we start doing this whole on-gassing, off-gassing with nitrogen, it's important to be aware that there's a couple of things that happen when we get cold. One of them is called blood shunting, right? And what that means are vascular constriction or vascular shunting. What that means is as you get cold, things get smaller, right? And every guy knows a little bit about things getting smaller in the cold, but your veins and your venous system do that as well. So we know that if we have a big hose and we're pushing water in it, we can push a lot of water through that, but we don't have, it doesn't matter. But as we start getting a smaller hose, it takes a lot more pressure to push the same amount of water through, right? We're constricting that down. So if we're constricting it down, it means our body's not able to off-gas nearly as easily, okay? We also know that from Henry's law that cold gas gets into our tissues and into the bloodstream more easily as well. And the other thing that happens is with blood shunting as well is the overall, the brain says, okay, wait a minute, you're getting cold. I need to protect the heart, brain, liver, and kidneys. And so it stops pumping blood out to the extremities as well. So if it slows down through shunting, slows down the blood flow to the extremities, and we're doing vascular constriction because of coldness, we're running into 3 issues all in one because of cold. So wearing the proper exposure gear for diving is huge. It's much more important than most people realize. One of the things we want to think about this as well, is the last place we want to be cold during a dive is when? Beginning or end?
I'm assuming probably it's the worst at the beginning, because then you start off miserable throughout the whole dive. But at the end, it's just as bad.
Absolutely. Well, absolutely. For what you're saying, absolutely, that's correct. But from the aspect of blood and gas coming out of our tissue compartments, the worst place to be cold is at the end of the dive, because where we need to be off-gassing that gas, we're suddenly not able to as efficiently as well. So we reduce our efficiency to off-gas considerably at the end of the dive by being cold. So one of the things we have to be taking into consideration is how we're going to make sure we stay warm, and at what point we're going to say, okay, I've started to get cold. It's time to end the dive and head on up. Most cold water dives are ended through thermal discomfort, but the big thing about that is sometimes we as guys aren't the smartest animals on the planet, right?
Things when we shouldn't.
Absolutely. I know Potato's smarter than most guys, right? And Megan just laughed. Because she knows it's true. It's funny because it's true. So the problem is guys get all, I'm tough, and they don't want to admit this, and that's the wrong thing to do during diving. So what you got to realize is as soon as you think you're getting cold or you're starting to feel cold, it's time to call the dive, because the chances of warming up once you get cold during a dive pretty thin, right? It's not generally something that's going to happen very easily. And there's certainly tricks to help get that warmth back up, but there's only so much you can do, right? Even with the tricks. So be aware that making sure we wear that proper exposure protection. One of the things that I absolutely hate hearing, it's one of my, we all have our pet peeves. This one's mine. I hate hearing about somebody that went on vacation to Honduras, to Florida, to the Caribbean, to ABC Islands, to Grenada, wherever. And they said, I just dove without a shirt and a pair of swim trunks all week. Good job. The thing about wearing a wetsuit in that water is, Adam, can you get hypothermia in 85-degree water?
Hypothermia, and I mean, yeah, if you're in it long enough.
Absolutely. Well, hypothermia is also cumulative. Did you know you could actually get hypothermia in the desert? We saw it in Afghanistan. We saw it in Iraq. We saw it during Desert Storm. we'd be outside 132 degrees outside, and somebody would come into the air condition, and the air conditioning was 85 degrees. A sudden drop in core body temperature is all it takes. So if it's 95, 105 degrees on the boat and you jump in the 85-degree water, that can actually cause a hypothermic effect. So we want to try and protect ourselves as best we can. There's three main reasons I can see that you should wear a wetsuit. The first one is protection against hypothermia and make sure that your body core stays warmer. Especially if you're doing 3 days for 5 straight days, hypothermia is cumulative. And so if hypothermia is cumulative, it's going to add up over the course of time and increase your chances of DCS every day by an exponential factor. So that's the first one. The second one for me is there's a lot of things out there that want to sting you, poke you, rub you, scratch you, or cut you. A wetsuit is a great way to prevent that. If you get into jellyfish, wetsuit. If you get a little too close to the fire coral, wetsuit, right? Fire coral, absolutely. I don't care if it says it's a rock or not. It absolutely moves towards you, not you towards it. Just kidding. It actually, but we lose track of where it's at, right? And I've seen people get into fire coral, right? So a little bit of exposure protection against the things out there as well. And then the final thing I like about it is if you did have to ditch your gear and float for a while, a basic 3 mil wetsuit is going to have some buoyancy to it and going to help save your life as well. So those are my things. I think everybody should wear a wetsuit no matter if they're in Grenada, ABC Islands, or wherever. It's just smart diving, and I'm all about smart diving. So question for the day, Adam, sound travels differently in the water than air. The major difference is it travels how much faster?
4 times.
Ding, ding, ding. Good job. He didn't even have to look at Megan. I liked it. So objects do, in fact, I've got these on a screen. And again, these may or may not be, but they are test questions that you will see during your test. Megan, objects do not appear the same in underwater environment as they do on land. Some major factors that influence this difference are?
4.
4 is exactly right. And Adam, I've got one more for you. You get to get double picked on. Our perception of light changes as it travels through the water, through the glass of the mask, and into the air pocket in front of our eyes. This gives the magnification of?
I know the answer to this. 25 times, but that's not even an answer. Action fracture. What are you looking at, Megan? Give me the look. Oh my goodness. 33.
33%. There you go. 33% faster. Absolutely. So there you go. Those may or may not be test questions, but they are. So just be aware. All right. So the next piece of this to kind of understand is the saturation and the desaturation model. How gas gets into the tissue compartments and how it comes out. So the history of this is actually really interesting. We came on in the early 1900s. We had this guy named Admiral Haldane. And Haldane was...
That's me.
Okay, I was like, it sounds just like mine. But Haldane was a British physicist working for the Admiralty. And he'd come across this problem after following the work of J. Lorraine Smith, who did oxygen toxicity work. And they were following and trying to figure out what happened at the Brooklyn Bridge. We knew that people were getting the bends, but why? They're going down, they're coming up, bad things were happening. And so how they started studying this for the British Admiralty, and he was actually pretty much a genius. And so when he came up with the idea is that there's a 2-to-1 ratio that we have to be aware of. When the pressure gains is twice that of the surface atmosphere that we go past, we need to be aware that the gas is going to build up and it's going to saturate into our tissue compartments. Okay. And so he came up with the idea of the critical difference being 2-to-1 ratio. And he did a lot of math behind this, but the simple fact is it was a 2-to-1 ratio, right? Mm-hmm. Well, fast forward a little bit, and we come up with Captain Haldane. And Haldane, I'm blanking. It wasn't Haldane. It was, oh gosh. You ever have those blank moments?
Yeah, all the time. I
just having a total blanking moment. Workman. There we go. I'm sorry. I had a total blank. Captain Robert Workman in the 50s. Captain Robert Workman was a Coast Guard captain, and he started working on Haldane's theories. And he said, "Huh, I think you're there, but I think you missed something. And I think what we need to do is go a little bit more micro on this and look at the pieces of the puzzle, not the puzzle as a whole." And so what Captain Robert Workman came up was the workman's critical difference. And what he says is it wasn't just a 2-1 ratio, but it was a 2-to-1 ratio of the nitrogen that was causing the problem. So when we get to a partial pressure of nitrogen that's twice that of what it is at the surface, then we have to step into some sort of controlled decompression, whether it be safety stops or sealings or decompression stops, in order to allow the nitrogen its time to be able to come out of the tissue. Because at that critical difference of double the nitrogen ratio, it's too much. Now, interestingly enough, Robert Workman was actually proven wrong later on. And we reverted back to Haldanian math with Albert Buhlmann. And Albert Buhlmann started in the 70s and in the 80s and came up with this idea that there's 16 tissue compartments. And the way these 16 tissue compartments work is they absorb nitrogen at different levels. So, and he theorized that these different levels could be measured by what's called a halftime. And we've all watched the zombie movies and the nuclear movies. We kind of get a good understanding of what a halftime is. But to give that a little bit re-explained, our bodies are affected by the pressure and the gases in the air that we breathe when we descend for a dive. So our bodies have tissues that soak up the partial pressures of the gases we breathe and increase this absorption at different rates as we descend. Now, these tissues act like sponges, if you will. When we descend, the gases in our tissues increase because of the higher pressure. Our body is theoretically made up of 16 different tissue compartments of sponges that absorb these gases all at different rates. And so this is where the term tissue halftime comes in. Tissue halftimes is a measure of how long it takes for the gas in our tissue to reduce by Bueller?
You said the half.
By half. There you go. I was hoping somebody would come up with that. So think of halftimes like this. If you have a soda bottle and shake it up, then you remove the lid, it explodes and bubbles go everywhere, right? But if you have that same bottle of soda and you drink half of it, there's less effect when you shake it up and quickly remove the cap. You've decreased the bubble potential, if you will, by half. Now, each time you have that soda in the bottle, reduce the amount of bubbles and increase the safety of not getting soda on your new white shirt, right?
Yeah.
So back in the day, Paul Burt was a scientist who studied how our bodies respond to the pressure changes, including the partial pressures of oxygen on the diver. Now, Paul Burt also helped discover that when a diver remains at depth, the gases in our tissue can cause problems when we ascend to the surface too quickly and don't use things like safety stops or deco stops to allow the bubbles to settle and slowly escape. So the gases that are absorbed by our tissues under pressure need time to gradually come out of our bodies.
Hey.
Give him a second here.
I'm in class. Just a second.
The beatings will continue to the morale increases.
Sorry.
No worries. What I'm just saying
I didn't
is
know I was in class, so
it's all good. So I just tell you this: we need time to allow the pressures to gradually come out of our body, right? So if we come up too fast, these gases can cause bubbles and can come out, and they create what's DCS or the bends. So just like when you shake up a soda bottle and then open it too quickly, bubbles go everywhere. So as we as divers, we use halftimes within our tissues to reduce the amount of and size of the bubbles that will be released by using slower ascents. So these bubbles and their bubble seeds, which is an important term we're going to talk about in a little bit, can escape very gradually through the course of the ascent, and to the point where we come to our deco stop or our safety stop. So it's really pretty interesting. So Albert Buhlmann took all this information from Burt and from Workman and studying Haldane as well. And he said, wait a minute, Workman, you're wrong. What? You're kind of close as well. So let's go back and let's take your work and let's apply it to Haldane. And we still use Haldanian math today in our algorithms. And he came up with the idea that there's 16 overall tissue compartments, and that through these half times, we could start measuring and put together an algorithm based upon that. And so it's interesting actually to compare and look at it. I actually have a copy of the Buhlmann math for us to look at it, and it's kind of interesting. So here's Workman with his M values from 65, Buhlmann with his ZHL 12 when he had 12 tissue compartments, and then finally his 16C, which was his latest, all the way from his version A, B to C. And so you can start getting at half time in minutes in the tissue compartment. So we can start saying, okay, at 106 feet freshwater, the half time of tissue compartment tissue compartment number 1 is 4 minutes. And he came up with this complete algorithm to get an idea of overall, here's what it's going to take for the half time for each tissue compartment at each depth. Now, one of the interesting things that at least I think is interesting, you may not truthfully agree, is that really most people think that the tissue compartments we need to worry about are the fast tissue compartments or the slow tissue compartments. And there's a debate on which one those are, right? Fast tissue compartments are the ones that absorb nitrogen really quickly, and they dissolve nitrogen. They diffuse nitrogen very quickly as well, like the brain stem, the spinal column, things like that. The slow tissue is like what I've got around my waist. Unfortunately, I'm chubby. And that'd be like fat, right? It takes a long time for fat to absorb anything and a long time for fat to dissolve anything, right, as well. And so the debate rages on that from the lesser educated, that they think, wait a minute, it's the fast tissue I got to worry about. It's the slow tissue I got to worry about. As I come up in the water column, da-da-da. Truthfully, it's not either of them. It's the mid tissue compartments that we need to worry about. Because what ends up happening if we don't come up quickly enough, or we in the water column, what ends up happening if we do it too slowly will actually cause more on-gassing in the mid-tissue compartments than we're off-gassing. So what ends up happening is 70% we're still on-gassing, 30% we're off-gassing. So that's part of the balance, is as we're doing this off-gassing procedure, that we need to come up fast enough to allow the gas to come up, but slow enough to not allow it to move from silent bubbles to bubble seeds to symptomatic bubbles. So that's...
I didn't realize that.
Absolutely. So where it really gets interesting is back in the 80s, there was a guy named Robert Pyle. You may have heard this name before. Have you guys heard the name Robert Pyle before?
I don't think so.
Megan?
I don't know.
How about pile stops? Have you heard of a pile stop?
That sounds vaguely familiar.
How about deep stop? Has anybody heard that term, doing a deep stop?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, there we go. So that's Robert Pyle. And I figured as much. But so Robert Pyle, back in the 80s, he was doing these incredibly deep air dives while he was spearfishing. And what he discovered is when he ascended too quickly, the air bladder in the fish would explode. It would ruin the meat. It didn't taste as good. So what he would do is at halfway, he was doing 200-foot air dives. And the guy was just nuts. But he would stop at 100 feet, and he would literally lance the air bladder in the fish so it wouldn't explode. It wouldn't ruin the meat. And what he discovered in this process was he felt better by doing these deep stops. So he theorized this idea that we need to do deep stops, a stop at half the distance between our deepest depth and the surface for a period of time to allow the gas to off-gas. Now, the most interesting thing I can tell you about Robert Pyle and deep stops is in a recent interview about 2 years ago, as Robert Pyle was asked, do you still do deep stops? And he says, absolutely not. The research is absolutely against that, and you should not do a deep stop. So if you have somebody that tells you you should be doing deep stops, refer them back to Dan, because Dan absolutely says, no, you should not be doing deep stops. So what was happening is this, and there's two interesting parts of this, is that he was getting up to a halfway point, he was stopping, but he was on-gassing more tissues than he was off-gassing, creating actually more harm in the long run. Now, the Navy, Naval Experimental Diving Unit, they did a study not long ago, this is about 4 years ago now, and they took several groups of divers, and they took group of divers number 1, and they put them on the dive and said, we've changed how your computer works, and we've made your computer 50% safer. I forget the exact number. They were using gradient factors, but we've optimized this, or we've made your computer safer. So follow your computer At the end of the dive, you will feel better. Anybody want to take a guess how many of the divers, what percentage of those divers felt better after the dive?
Probably not.
90% of them, right? It was a very substantial. It was like 94.5% felt better at the end of the dive. I guess what they had done to their computers.
It sounds like they took away deep stop.
Well, they didn't do anything. They left their computers exactly alone, and they were doing the same dives they were doing before. But they told them we're making it better. So at the end of it, amazingly, they felt better. They took another group of divers. They said we've made your dive computers much more aggressive. There's a chance you won't feel as good after this dive. And they sent them on a dive. Guess how many of them felt worse after the dive?
It sounds like
Majority of them.
Majority of it. It was 90-something% again. They told them they're going to feel worse, and so they felt worse. The funny thing is they didn't do anything to their computers either. And I love reading the control group stuff where they didn't do anything to their computers. They took another group of divers. They said, we've optimized your computers. You're going to feel better after this end of the dive. Again, 90-something% of them felt better. They made their computers more aggressive. They should have felt worse. So the point of the study was extremely interesting in that the biggest point to take away from this is if I told you this is going to be a better dive based upon my science, the chances of you having a better dive are substantial. If I tell you you're going to have a worse dive, you're going to have a worse dive. So the thing about divers is and this was a big thing in the 90s and the 2000s, even into 2010, is divers were adjusting their gradient factors, the conservativeness of their computers based upon how they felt, which was actually interesting enough. It turns out this was absolutely the worst thing because what they ended up doing is constantly changing. I felt good. I felt good. I felt good. I felt good. So I increased the aggressiveness of my computer, and then all of a sudden I got the bends. Oh crap! Why did I get the bends? Well, because you were screwing with your computer, dude. You didn't stick with the science. You stuck with I felt like this, and right. I feel this is a very Karen way to judge a dive computer. I felt it was good. That's probably not the best way to judge the validity of anything is based upon how you just feel after this dive, because there's so many more factors involved with that. It's interesting. NETO, Naval Experimental Diving Unit, loves doing DCS studies, and one of the things that they have the hardest time with is they can take 10 sailors and have 5 of them get the bends and 5 of them not get the bends, but they're all same age, about the same physical shape. We're living in the same area, eating the same food, doing the same dives. Why did 5 of them get the bends and 5 of them didn't? So the interesting thing in talking to some of the researchers out there that I've had a chance to talk to, this is a very exciting time because we still really don't understand the overall reason why some people will submit to or succumb to larger bubbles and some people won't. Now, cool factor is we kind of go through that process and understanding the idea of what causes these bubbles in DCS. There's a few things we can do to make sure we maximize our potential against DCS. Anybody interested in a few ideas on how you can make sure you avoid DCS?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, right?
Oh,
one of them is very easy. Stay warm. Make sure you're warm throughout the dive, especially towards the end of the dive. That will reduce your chances of getting DCS by a factor of 2 to 3. Simple things like that. Hydration, well rested. Those are other great ones that we already know. Making sure we reduce the work factor at the end of the dive and keep the heavier work factor at the beginning of the dive instead. And the reason being is if we have the heavier work factor at the end of the dive, the agitation per Henry's law is causing things to kick up really heavy and we're off-gassing very quickly. So making sure to reduce that effort that when we do a safety stop, we relax, we're chilled out. That will reduce our chances of getting DCS considerably as well. But how about this? If I could tell you guys a way that you could avoid DCS by a factor of 10, would that be interesting?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Studies say, and this we can thank our Nordic friends, that if we do a medium cardio exercise for 20 to 30 minutes, 19 hours is the magic number, but 24 to 19 hours prior to a dive, we will reduce our chances of getting DCS by a factor of 10.
Oh, shit.
Absolutely. And here's the reason it's actually really interesting. Megan, why do you think that is? If I exercise the day before a dive, why would that reduce my chances of getting DCS?
I'm wondering if it has to do with the lactic acid that you release as you exercise and exert your muscles.
You're the first person to get that one pretty darn close. It's pretty close to what's happening. In the lactic acid, there's also an enzyme that causes a lubrication of the venous system. And what ends up happening is, as the bubbles come out, if the venous system is well lubricated, they can travel more easily through the venous system to the alveolar, and we can expel them. You're the first person to get that one on the first try. So good job. That was really awesome. Now, reason that is so important with this lubrication that the bubbles can't get stuck is, if you ever looked at a 10-inch glass of beer sitting on the counter on the bar and watched the bubbles get larger from the bottom to the top?
They compound as they rise.
They do. They get bigger. But why are they getting bigger? What's the key factor?
Because decreased volume or decreased pressure as they're rising in the water.
And that's what you'd think. But is there really going to be that much pressure differentiation for Boyle's law to take an effect in 10 inches?
No.
Exactly. So what's actually happening is we're getting to watch perfusion in action. What's happening is these bubbles by themselves are coming up and they're literally crashing into each other. And as they crash into each other, they perfuse together, and two bubbles become one big bubble. And then those two bigger bubbles become an even bigger bubble, and they're crashing into each other and perfusing together. So that's a great example of perfusion. So if the bubbles aren't able to crash into each other as easily, all of a sudden now we have the ability for them to exit the system a lot more easily. And we have a 10-factor less chance of getting DCS.
That makes sense. I mean, logically,
Crazy, huh?
it adds to making sense.
Absolutely. So as we start looking at these ideas of what's happening in our body, it's extremely interesting to understand these as well. Making sure we ascend at a proper speed. If it's cold, slow your ascent a little bit. Do a longer safety stop. And make sure we don't do heavy work. We don't get super excited. We want to be Michael Phelps at the end of the dive and swim to see the whole damn ocean in the last 5 minutes, right? Don't do that. That's bad, right? Take that time. So it's definitely interesting to understand that as well.
So in this instance, like, you're getting low on air and you want to swim under the water to your safety stop point, so you overexert yourself to your exit location is actually bad. Sorry, Megan.
That is absolutely not a good thing. Take your time. I'd be willing to bet you can still get to the surface and do your safety stop and swim on the surface gently and take your time. Nikki and I lovingly call it lake time or ocean time. We are never in a hurry to get anywhere. We love to take our time. And it's one of the great things, and this is kind of a pro tip for you guys. One of the things Nikki and I have discovered over the years of diving together off of boats is that we're usually about the mid person to get in the water, but we're always the last person to get back on the boat. We jump in, the whole group stops and meets up together, and then they all take off like they're trying to see the whole damn ocean in one dive. Nikki and I have never done that. We stop, we look in this crevice, we look in that crevice. We always get lost from the group every single time. We know where the group's at. They're way ahead of us 2 miles because they think they're Olympic swimmers. But the cool thing is when we get back on the boat, we'll listen to them talk, and they'll say, "Oh, I saw a crab," and "Oh yeah, I saw a lobster. Cool." And I saw a ray. And Benjamin, Nikki, what'd you guys see? Well, we saw 6 turtles, 12 lobsters, 8 rays, 3 sharks. They're like, "Well, how'd you see so much?" And we stopped and took our time. We looked at this square foot of ocean for a while, and eventually we moved to this square foot of ocean, and we took our time. Right? Never being afraid.
That's probably one of Adam and I's biggest pet peeves is everybody's in a rush to get somewhere. And I'm like, there's so much to see.
Yeah,
absolutely.
We're always making people go slower than they want to, it seems like.
Absolutely. Take your time overall, but it's also just good diving to keep you safe. Like I said, we call it ocean or lake time. We're never be in a hurry. Take your time and allow things to happen. If you're getting to the point where your heart's starting to beat faster, other than that time, Adam, when you looked across the coral and you saw Megan's lovely shape, and you're like, "Oh, I love her," that's okay. But swimming really fast to get to any point is probably not the best idea in the world. So a couple of key factors for you. So one of the things we kind of briefly talked about a little bit yesterday is the idea of what accelerated decompression can do for you, running a different gas other than just your back gas for like nitrox, right? So I've got a cool little, and this starts introducing a little bit of kind of decompression theory. One of the ways we can maximize the gradient factor of desaturation is we can use what's called accelerated decompression. So this is an overall basic deco dive, right? And overall, if this is the point, if we got to the point with 40 minutes of decompression, if we used a 40% back gas throughout the dive at 82 feet, and we had to build up 40 minutes of decompression, this is where we'd be at. But if we switched over from a 40% bottle to a 50%, that's just 10% more, or I'm sorry, 20, I'm gonna take that back. I apologize. We're using a back gas at 21%, and we build up 40 minutes of decompression, and we switched over to a 50% nitrox. There we go. Sorry about that. I got off on a tangent there. We would go from 40 minutes of decompression to 24 minutes of decompression. If we use two different types of decompression gases, nitroxes, what we'd end up having is gas 1 at 50% and gas 2 at 100%. We could take a 40-minute decompression time down to 19 minutes. The reason for that is a lot of fun. And the way I like to look at it is if you look at a highway or freeway going into LA, right? If there's only one way in and one way out of LA, and there's 10 lanes on the other side, that's what's happening with 21% nitrox, right? We've got air going in, we've got nitrogen going in. We've got nitrogen coming out, we got air coming out, right? But when we go to a 50% blend of nitrox, what we're literally doing is we're cutting off half the lanes for the nitrox to be able to get into the city, but we're letting all the nitrox that wants to come out of the city. So we're literally flushing the nitrox out by not allowing more nitrogen to replace it. And if we get to a 50% and 100%, with 100%, we're literally cutting off all nitrogen's lanes for being able to go into the city. We're letting all the nitrogen that we want to come out of the city. Is that a kind of a good visual idea for you guys?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So
that's
now you tell me the math on, because you're not I don't remember, I don't know, and I want to learn this from you, but breathing 100% oxygen surface is bad, and right? So
nope,
if
you can breathe 100% oxygen to about 20 feet.
So, but on the surface is what I was saying. So surface, but below the surface, 20 feet is what you're allowed to dive that, so you don't get in trouble with the.
You can breathe 100% oxygen on the surface too. It's not a bad thing. I mean, certainly limited to the amount of time because of toxicity, but with 100% nitrogen, 100% oxygen, you can breathe it to about, I apologize, to about 16 feet. 16 to 17 feet is about as far as you want to go with 100% oxygen, because you start running into that high partial pressure. Okay. But the nice thing is you are letting the nitrogen out of your system really, really fast.
So essentially at your safety stop is where you're allowed to do that. So
yes, absolutely. But you can also do 90% a little deeper. You can do 80% a little deeper. My favorite deco gas, I like 55 or 65%. Anywhere in that, those are my go-to primary number one deco blends that I use. In fact, I've got 2 bottles of 60% in my truck right now that I'm going to use this weekend. That's my go-to. But if you think about it, utilizing your math, what's the deepest I could dive? A bottle of 60% if I'll allow it to go to 1.6. Anybody know?
No, I need to figure that out, because that's kind of, so that's the one that I struggle with, is doing the reverse on things. So 60%. Walk me through the process on this one, if you wouldn't mind. So the gas, 60%.
Absolutely. So the first thing we need to do is divide the 2 out, right? Remember?
Okay.
So if we're going to figure out the maximum operating depth, so we want to divide the 1.6 divided by the 0.6 of the gas, right?
So that's what I did wrong, is you got to convert it to 0.6.
1.6, yep, is your maximum partial pressure divided by the 0.6 of the gas itself, should equal about 2.66.
Okay, 2.67. So does that round up?
Sure. No, that's good.
2.67. So that's our
Uh-huh.
atmospheres. Is that correct?
Yep, that's our atmospheres. Now, remember, we've still got to take out the atmospheric pressure, so we get down to just hydrostatic pressure only. So we need to subtract 1 from that.
So
Get rid of that.
1.6.
Yep. So and then multiply that by 33.
Okay, so I can go down to 54.78 feet.
Yep.
So
So
essentially,
I use my first deco stop on 60% is usually 50 feet. So at 50 feet, I go ahead and switch over to a 60% blend, and that's what I breathe on that all the way up until if I'm going to do another gas. So I'll do my 50-foot stop, my 40-foot stop, my 30-foot stop, and my 20-foot stop, all on 50%.
So now, since I heard you say that they were studying and saying that it's what I taught and was learned was you're supposed to do a deep stop. So are you saying from what we learned is we're not supposed to be doing deep stops now, or are we supposed to be?
You should not be doing deep stops. Unfortunately, anybody teaching deep stops is living in some pretty strong past information. Dan.org does not support deep stops. And the interesting thing is, if there's a great article that where Robert Pyle, the inventor of deep stops, was interviewed, and Robert Pyle does not do deep stops anymore because the research does not support it. So the Naval Experimental Diving Unit, Dan and Robert Pyle don't support deep stops. So I'm gonna stick with them.
Is that fairly new then? Like you said, within 2 years?
Last 4 or 5 years has really kind of come out and really kind of been really on the nose of don't do deep stops. There are still people living with information prior to that refuse to buy into it.
Nobody's taught me anything different because when we went through art class, that's what I was taught. So
sure, and
you updated me on that.
Absolutely, that's what the latest information. Like I said, that's not from me. That's from Dan as well as Nito and Scripps. Well, Scripps is in there as well, but
so we're still just following our ascent rate then.
Yep, absolutely.
33 feet a minute or something.
33 feet per minute.
Okay, deal. I can't believe I remembered that, but I got it. So 1 atmosphere per minute. So you were just saying a second ago, you said stops, 30 feet, 20 feet. What are you implying by that?
So when we get into decompression, we start dealing with something a little differently. So we start dealing with what's called a decompression stop. So when we break the non-decompression limit, we move into what's called decompression diving. So in an NDL dive, a safety stop, while yes, it is technically a deco stop, is more like a yield sign or a yellow. You should do it. Absolutely. Please do safety. But if you blow a safety stop, you probably won't die. Now, when we pass that NDL limit and we go into deco stops, you have to do deco stops. They are required. A decompression stop is the procedure that always takes place at the end of the dive on a decompression dive. And this is the time that we spend at a given depth to reduce the amount of nitrogen in the tissue compartments before we rise to the surface. The decompression stops differs according to each dive profile, dependent upon the maximum depth reached during the dive, as well as the time spent at this depth. Now, depth and time are given by decompression tables or by the dive computer as well. So you need to be aware that as you start moving past that NDL, if you break a deco stop, you're probably most likely going to get the bends. Whereas if you break a safety stop, you're most likely going to be okay. But why live with most likely when you can live with, yes, I'm going to be okay.
Okay.
So that's what we're talking about. And we're kind of getting the idea. And I'm kind of trying to give you the introduction of what's past non-decompression diving. So,
okay. Well, I learned that a little bit with my computer before because I was doing dives on my computer, but I didn't change the elevation. So we were in the ocean. My computer is set for high elevation, and we were at depth, and my computer made me do deco stop, even though I didn't technically need it, but I still followed it. I was at Megan was like sitting at the surface, and I was sitting at like 10 feet, 15
was there
feet.
for 12 minutes.
12 minute decompression stop because my computer said I had to, even though I didn't have to.
Absolutely. It's just good policy to make sure that you're following your computer and doing what you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, and I didn't understand it because that was earlier on in my diving, like when I was learning and understanding my equipment, but it was something I learned afterward. But that experience helped me understand more afterwards. I just asked the questions and learned from it. So
I get a segue message. Use there we go. All right. So as we start getting into this idea, decompression stops is the point where we pass non-decompression limits. And the ideal way to make a good decompression stop is to stay in the horizontal position for as long as you possibly can. That way your body is able to off gas completely at the same rate throughout the entire body. Same thing with a safety stop. You should always do your safety stop in trim. So that's how we make sure we do this, right? We extend the body and it allows us to off gas equally. And also the other thing we want to do is we want to make sure we're minimizing any additional effort that we're doing on this dive, and we make sure that we're breathing normally. Breathing quickly or holding our breath during a safety stop is really not a great idea. Our goal with our safety stop or our deco stop is to off gas. If we're holding our breath, we are not able to off gas. If we start hyperventilating, we're going to off gas too quickly. We want to breathe normally and naturally while we're in that good horizontal position and a nice hover and relaxed. And you guys will all see me do my Zen thing. Just relax your brain, relax your breathing, relax your body, and just enjoy the time watching fish float by. So that's how we basically do that. What ends up happening with a deco stop that's different than a safety stop is that there's going to be specific levels. Generally, your first deco stop will be 20 feet, typically, right? As you get farther and farther into deco, those initial ceilings, and just like the name sounds, you can't go above that ceiling. So if your deco stop is 20 feet, you have to stay at 20 feet. But as you get deeper and deeper, and your deco stops become bigger and bigger, you need to make sure that you're watching your computer, because it will sometimes bring your deco stop down to 30 feet or 40 feet or 50 feet, and it'll start you at a progressively deep stop to allow the nitrogen to be able to come off at the correct level.
Okay.
Make sense?
That makes sense.
Absolutely. So let's step back into the safety stop overall. So we remember very clearly the safety stop for 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes overall. So I've got a nice little chart that I like to share here. So what we talk about in this is as the tissue compartments become saturated, when they get to 100%, they hit a value of what we call the M value. And the M, sounds really cool, but all this means M stands for maximum value line. It's not really all that complicated. It is as they start to go to a point of super saturation is when the bubbles start coming out. Okay. So here's the hard part about this is, Megan, today your M value is going to be at a certain point. Tomorrow it will change. It will not be the same. But your M value and my M value will probably never be the same. And Adam, your M value won't be the same as either of ours. Our M values are all based upon our physiology, our physics, our health, how we process food, how hydrated we are, how rested we are, how calm our mind is, and our genetics. When it comes down to it, there's a lot of factors that go into what that actual M value is. But what we do know about this is that if we spend less time in safety stops and less deco, we've moved from bubble seeds to silent bubbles up to symptomatic bubbles, and we decrease our safety. As we start doing more deco, we create less risk and more safety and less symptoms overall. So overall, I want you guys to take the idea, a few ideas from this. That one, dive tables and safety stops are how we're going to manage the size of the bubbles in our bloodstream. Second piece is safety stops assist in the reduction of the size of the bubbles. Guys, there's no clear line between good and bad, and it's going to change every day. Final piece of that is every diver is different in the way their body manages the size of the bubbles and the reduction of those bubbles. So the key point of this is do a safety stop.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to kind of blow your minds just a little bit here. We took a group of divers, and this is from Nito, not me, that did this study. We took these groups of
just like less than a year ago from Brett on Facebook. Maybe it was you that posted it on on the.
It was me. Yeah, I'm the one who brought this to Brett, and Brett loves it, and so absolutely. This came through 2 TDI from Nito. So the interesting thing is they did these dives on nitrox for 25 minutes to 125 feet or 120 feet. And it's interesting as we look at this, diver group number 1 did a direct ascent. And what we discovered is that 16 to 17 minutes after the dive, they were at about 117,000 bubbles per cubic liter. That's a lot of freaking bubbles. Now, over the next several hours, we can see there's definitely a reduction in the bubbles. At the 60-minute mark, there are about 24,000 bubbles per cubic liter. And then finally, at the 2-hour mark, there are about 19,000 bubbles per cubic liter. Group number 2 did a 2-minute safety stop at 10 feet. We can see dramatically less bubbles in their stream. And what we can see is that about 15 minutes, there were almost 20,000 bubbles per cubic liter in the count. And they decreased gradually from there to the point where they were at 2 hours, and they were at about 7,000 bubbles per cubic liter. Now let's be group number 3. Group number 3 did a 1-minute safety stop at 20 feet and a 4-minute safety stop at 10 feet. When they came out of the water at the 15-minute mark, they actually had less bubbles, and they were about 8,000 bubbles per cubic liter. And finally, at the 43-minute mark, they were at 0 bubbles per cubic liter measurable. Pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Now,
well, since we learned this, we've always tried to start doing longer safety stops at 20 feet and then working our way to 15 feet and then 10 feet. We start our safety stops at a deeper depth and then work our way up.
That's awesome. So my main takeaways from this is a safety stop reduces bubbles, a longer safety stop reduces more bubbles than a short one, and a 5-minute safety stop during repetitive dives increases your safety margin considerably. Please do a safety stop.
Yeah.
Easy enough. Now, as we kind of move on from this, one of the things that happens during diving, sometimes we miss a safety stop or we miss a deco stop. And the good news is we have the opportunity. If you miss a safety stop from 10 feet, you can and you've been up to the surface for less than a minute, you can absolutely redescend back to the 10 feet. And all you need to do is complete your full safety stop, 3, 4, 5 minutes, and add another minute to 2 minutes just to make sure you're safe. So it happens. So can you redo a safety stop? If you've been on the surface for less than a minute, absolutely. Okay. And one of the things, if you miss a deco or a safety stop and you come on the boat and you begin to become symptomatic, and that's the key here, you become symptomatic. Never, ever, ever try and recompress a diver underwater. Why do you think that is, Megan?
If they go unconscious, you're going to have more problems.
Absolutely. You're just creating more problems. Plus, it's no fun using the AED at 20 feet, right?
Yeah. Talking to everybody.
Absolutely. So the last piece of this is you ever notice how hard it is to get on the damn boat or climb up the dang hill after a dive?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There's a lot of cardiovascular strain on you. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question, like thinking about this. So when we were in Curacao, they went on a night dive, and why they did the night dive somewhere where they couldn't kneel down or, and everybody shut their lights off. And a bunch of people, obviously, because you lose all sorts of, perception, because everybody had shut their lights off to try to see the translucent, particles or bioluminescence. A bunch of people shot up like 20 feet, because they weren't watching their dive computers.
Mm-hmm.
Because none of them went to the surface, had they just done an extra long safety stop, they potentially wouldn't have had issues, right? Because, yeah, they shot up 20 feet, but they didn't go clear to the surface. They could have just done a longer safety stop to get rid of those bubbles and not had, some of them got the bends afterwards. So,
yep, just absolutely do a little longer safety stop. Make sure you're doing that nice 20 foot. And with that, take your time, especially if with that, I imagine there's a little bit of panic between the ears as well. So take a little time, do a little extra safety stop. It absolutely can make a huge difference. Let that gas come off. The last piece of this as well that could have helped as well is what we call a body decompression. And one of the reasons that Nikki and I are always the last on the boat is we stop and do a body decompression. And what that means is we don't get them immediately out of the water. We've done our nice long deco stops, our nice long safety 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minute safety stops. Nikki and I end up usually doing about a 5 minute safety stop, truthfully. Sometimes longer. This weekend in Yellowstone, we came back to shore, and most of our safety stops were 15 to 20 minutes because we were swimming along, enjoying the bacteria beds and everything else. So we took our time. But there's another piece of this, and it's called a body decompression. And what that means is once you finally finish up your 5 minute, 3 minute, 4 minute safety stop, you come to the surface, you leave your head out of the water. The good news is your body is still under pressure. So spending an extra 5 or 10 minutes just floating in the water allows the bubbles to come out a little slower than they would if you were on the surface, and it gives your body a little bit more time to decompress and allow the bubbles to come out at a more natural rate, and reduce the chances of getting things like DCS. And the other piece of that as well, and the reason we do that is we realize that we're going to have to climb up a stinking ladder with 80 pounds of freaking gear up, or if we're at Rye Rate, we're going to get out of the water, we're going to climb up that stupid hill, and we're going to get all out of breath, and we're going to get the old cardio pumper kicking along. And we know that because of that, and because of Henry's law, that we're causing more nitrogen to come out of our system than is need be, right? The same reason we don't jump in a hot tub right after a dive, because it opens up the cells, nitrogen comes out, we get the bends, right?
So it was sad as I see a lot of people jump in the pool after we get out of the water, after we get off the boat, which is not hurt each other when we're like driving like an hour or 30 minutes from the boat. But I see people get in the hot water all the time.
Yeah, the hot tub is just a really bad idea, especially with the residual nitrogen. And some of the ways you can avoid that is certainly do that longer safety stop like we talked, but add a body decompression to it as well to make sure we're allowing the nitrogen. The way I like to think about it is be gentle to yourself. Be gentle on your body. If you're on a dive, you need to be on ocean time, not New York time, right? And too many of us we want to hurry and get on the boat, hurry and get off the boat, hurry and get off the boat, hurry. We got to get over to the bar. We got to get drunk, right? Whatever it is, right? I see all kinds of silly behaviors on dive trips that just make me laugh. And that's some of it. But take your time and do a body decompression. Leave your head out of the water. Talk about the dive. I mean, I promise you guys that spending 10 minutes floating in the ocean next to the boat is going to be better than anything you're going to be doing back here. It's better than roofing. It's better than being on Zoom calls. It's better than having to chase the kids down and curse at them because they broke something today. And you think this is why animals eat their young, right?
Well, our dive trips, it seems like they always send us to do our safety stop. They always find a reef spot where we can hang out at the top of the reef. And me and Megan typically try to drain our tank as much as we can, waiting for everybody to get out of the water. So we're typically last out of the water. So we do a lot of that, just hanging out the reef and getting out of the water last.
Absolutely. And it's a good way to be.
That we're doing it right.
Absolutely. That's it. All you're doing, just take your time. Overall, there's a lot of issues that can happen with diving. And one of them absolutely is caused by rushing. Take your time. Allow that full safety stop. Allow that full body decompression. If you've had a bad dive or you've had some fast, take a little extra time. Relax yourself. Diving shouldn't be a stressful thing. I really disagree with the dive groups that go out and do 5-a-days. I think that's just, honestly, you're just asking for problems. Or reverse profiles as well. That's another big, huge no-no. Don't go out and do an 80-foot, 60-foot, 50-foot, 110-foot dive. You're asking for problems, right?
We've personally seen that. We like, weirdly enough, we've seen a lot of the things you're talking about in person.
And you've seen the bends too.
We've seen the bends from people doing those things.
Absolutely. It makes you think, right? And so, knock on wood, Nikki and I have never gotten the bends, and we've got, a couple thousand dives each, right? And the reason we haven't got the bends is we take our time and we relax. We try and follow these processes. I just read a great article from Dan the other day. It was awesome. It was is the undeserved DCS hit a real thing? And the authors, I'll cut to the chase. The author said that's horseshit. If you get the DCS, it's because you weren't doing something the way you should have been doing it. You earned it.
Yeah.
So
diving is safety.
This was a PhD MD in barotrauma medicine that came up with this idea that if you get DCS, it's because you did something that you weren't paying attention to. And overall, it was interesting. He basically said, look, we're using a very rudimentary, I mean, we might as well be using an abacus idea to monitor the amount of gas in our system. Here's the limitation with dive computers, guys. Does your dive computer take into account your body temperature?
Nope.
No.
Does it take into account the water temperature?
Yep.
It does?
Well, it doesn't. It records it, but probably doesn't take into account the.
Exactly. It tells you what it is, but it doesn't take it into account into the algorithm at all. Does it take into account your respiratory factor, how fast you're breathing or how slow you're breathing?
Makes sense.
I mean, it calculates what we consume, but I wouldn't say it calculates a respiratory rate.
It doesn't. It doesn't take into account how fast your heart beating, how fast you're breathing. It'll tell you that you're going through your gases fast, but it has no effect on the algorithm for the dive at all.
Ben,
I was actually thinking that the other day as we were talking about agitation and how when your heart beats faster, things get moving. I was like, man, with the fact that my Apple Watch is can track my depth and everything else, it can track my heart rate and my respiration. It's like, wouldn't that be cool if somehow that could integrate into a dive computer?
There is experiments going on right now in Europe on that, but they haven't reached the real world yet. So as we start looking at those things, it doesn't take into account your body temperature, the water temperature, your respiratory rate, your heart rate. Has either Adam, Megan, has it ever asked you to put your weight in or your cholesterol?
Nope.
Your BMI?
Mm-mm.
I would think some of those factors might affect how your body responds to absorption and diffusion of nitrogen, right?
sounds like we will make our own dive computer and implement some of that stuff.
Now, there are some great, Garmin being the leader on that in biometric measuring is absolutely doing studies on that and putting that information together and figuring out how they can measure that accurately. What they found was while they do have a gas saturation meter on their watches, I can tell you what my pulse ox is, my pulse oxidation is on the surface. What they found it was wildly inaccurate once it got wet. So they're working on that, and I talked to Patrick Denko on that, and the studies are very interesting on that. But the problem they're having is the transmission through water and how we monitor that, right?
And what's funny is as we were doing the reading, and it was talking about heat loss and stuff. Said so those that are a little rounder, we stay warmer. Now I'm not encouraging you to go gain a bunch of weight, and then we get to the next section and it's like, well, if you have more adipose tissue, then you're going to retain more nitrogen potentially. So
absolutely, you're more susceptible to cold as a smaller person, but you're more susceptible to DCS as a larger person. So it's all a balance, right? As you kind of put this out. So be aware that as you use that computer, one of the biggest limitations is the computer is set for this, right? The problem is you and I are all over the board when it comes to that. So we're somewhere on the scale, and the computer has no way of knowing where we're at on that scale.
Makes sense.
Yes. Now, there's some interesting things out there. Let's see. Have it with me. I think I took it downstairs. I did. Nikki and I have something called an O-dive, and it's pretty interesting in that it's a puck that has an ultrasound ability to measure the size of the bubbles. But the problem is, in terms of utilizing something like that, it's the same as using a Garmin for heart rate through a workout. It gives you interesting information, but in terms of guiding you for your next dive, it's not fantastic, right? It gives you basic information that's interesting to know. During this workout, my heart rate was this, my perspiration was this, my pace was this, my da-da-da-da, right? But in terms of utilizing that information for my next dive, it becomes very, very difficult. So there are things coming out and coming along that do things like that. But as of right now, there's your dive computer is about the same as your computer, your calculator on your desk, right? It has a basic idea of 1 + 1 = 2, but how does that affect you, right? So be aware of that. Definitely very interesting as we kind of go through that process. What questions do you guys have at this point?
Don't have any.
Well, I think you guys have been really great about asking questions as we go along, and I appreciate that greatly. You have no idea. So I think we kind of covered that. I think we've got a pretty good understanding of how DCS happens. So some of the things to be aware of in DCS, as DCS happens, what's happening is bubbles are literally forming in the bloodstream. And the first part of DCS becomes skin bends. We start getting a rash. And what's happening is the nitrogen is actually small enough in the bubbles that it's actually trying to perfuse through the skin, and it causes a rash. Well, there's something else that's actually happening that's kind of interesting in that is one of the reasons we're getting the rash and the effect is as bubbles that are larger than they should be, they move past silent bubbles into bubble seeds, and from bubble seeds to symptomatic bubbles, they're starting to be recognized by the white blood cells in our body. And the white blood cells, their whole job is to say, wait a minute, you don't belong here. You're out of here. We're going to go to war. We're going to war. It's interesting that if you have pus, what pus is it's dead white blood cells. They went to war against an infection, and when they lost, it became pus. That's what pus is. I think that's super interesting, right? But the same thing happened is that these white blood cells, they see the bubbles in our bloodstream and they go to war. And where the places where they're going to war is these bubbles are trying to come out, it causes a base reaction. Well, as these bubbles get larger and the war gets bigger, sometimes they get trapped in our joints and we start getting sore. We start getting sore in the muscles, start getting sore in the joints. That's the same thing with, you ever had a cold, Megan, where you were laying on the couch and just everything hurt?
Yep.
Right? That's the white blood cells in your body fighting it out, saying you ain't supposed to be here. And as we all know, war is not good for anybody. What's it good for? Nothing, right? I throw a little musical reference in there for you for today. So that's what's happening, right? Is we start moving past skin bends, level 1 to level 2. We start getting joint pains in the muscles, pains in the joints. That's because the bubbles are getting trapped in there and causing problems. And then finally, we get to DCS level 3. And that's where things get really bad. It's very much like an AGE, an arterial gas embolism as well. We all remember those 80s and 90s movies where in the detective novels, the guy had the heart attack. We found out that the nurse stabbed him with the hypodermic needle and shot him full of air, and the air went to the heart and he had a heart attack, but we couldn't tell because it was air bubbles, right? Well, that's same thing, right? Nitrogen bubbles, air bubbles, they get trapped in the bloodstream and they go through and they can cause blockages. So tingling in the arms, right? They can get trapped into the cardiovascular system. They can cause blockages there where blood can't get to points. They can get into the heart. They can cause the heart to stop, have trouble beating or stop beating. Even worse, they could travel up into the neck and into the brain, and they can start causing blockages. So we start getting things like slurred speech, confusion, loss of vision, narrowing of vision, ringing in the ears, things like that. So DCS level 1 through 3 is definitely of concern. We need to recognize this very quickly. Now, the first aid for DCS is actually fairly simple on our side, at least. The first thing we need to do is treat them for shock. Get them laying down and relaxed. What we want to do is try and get the heart to slow down as much as possible to stop making those bubbles travel as fast as they can. We want to get them on oxygen as quickly as we can, and we want to hydrate. Adam, why do you think we want to hydrate a DCS victim?
Because when you hydrate, it opens up your blood vessels and stuff so that things will move smoothly and not outside the skin, so to speak.
Absolutely. I like to think of the blood as the conveyor belt of the body, right? It's what allows stuff to travel in and allows stuff to travel out. If we lubricate that up with water so it can move a little more easily, allow that to travel out. So get them on oxygen fast, early, and quickly, right? Even if you're not sure, get them on oxygen. It's not going to hurt anything. It's just going to make them, give them a little contact high anyway. Woo! 100% oxygen has a little bit of narcotic effect. Life is good, right? And it's legal. Even better, right? So we don't get thrown in jail for breathing 100% oxygen. Do other things that get us high, we definitely get thrown in jail, especially in Idaho.
Explain that to me a little bit. Why does oxygen make you feel so much better?
The oxygen has a slight narcotic effect. Pure oxygen does, at least. And because of that narcotic effect, it anesthetizes the tissue compartments and the blood or the nerve endings as well. And it gives us that narcotic feeling as it goes in the brain. It anesthetizes parts of the brain as well. So Pure oxygen has a slight narcotic effect to be aware of.
So just like you were explaining, so nitrox itself, that's why we feel better when we get out of the water from nitrox and we're not so sore and everything, is because we're having that residual.
That's the truth of nitrox. Absolutely. Is that because oxygen has a narcotic effect, we feel better after the dives. There's also the thought process as well, is because your body is not processing as much nitrogen into the system, it doesn't have to process as much nitrogen out of the system. And if your body doesn't have to work as much, then you're not going to be as tired after a dive as well. So there's that thought process as well. But there's no scientific evidence really that we can relate to that says that's what's happening, that there's actually an energizing effect afterwards. The only reasonable idea that the scientists are able to currently come up with is that oxygen has, because of its narcotic effects and anesthetizing principles. Say that one 5 times fast, by the way. Because of that anesthetizing factors of it, it gives us a bit of a narcotic contact high, right? If you will, and we feel better because of that. We're anesthetized, right? We don't feel as much, right? Life is good. So that's what's happening. So overall, we watch for this. We make sure we're looking for the signs and symptoms: dizziness, vertigo, ringing in the ears, things that aren't right, staggering, loss of hand-eye coordination, motor coordination, things like that, rashes. We watch for those very closely. And then, because that's it's not a very common, but it's a common enough thing. And then we get them on oxygen, get them laying down, get them hydrated, and we call 911 and get them to a chamber, and they get the opportunity to, hopefully they have DAN, because if they don't have DAN insurance, they get the opportunity to spend $10,000 on a chamber ride. That doesn't sound like very much fun. And potentially another $10,000 on a helicopter ride, which recently happened to somebody I know as well. So be aware that DCS is definitely not something to mess with. But interestingly enough, last year, 58% of dive maladies were because of something else. You guys have any idea what that was?
Nope. Teach me.
Narcosis?
Nope. Cardiovascular issues. Cardiovascular issues. 58% of dive maladies were because of some sort of cardiovascular issue, primarily a heart attack of some kind, or a cardiac event.
You were literally talking to somebody that has had family members deal with that. Megan's dad.
Yeah, it's scary stuff. So 58%. So while we all want to talk about the big hairy monster of being DCS, it's not the big hairy monster that most people think of. Most people, majority, 99%, survive a DCS hit. Most people don't survive a cardiac event, especially while diving. It's a real thing. Now we're going to get into a little bit of my theory on why that is, why most diving accidents are cardiac related in a little bit, but we're going to go through a couple ideas. The first one that we kind of get the idea of, it masks the symptoms and signs of DCS, and it gives you the potential of having DCS-esque symptoms, is called a PFO, or a patent foramen ovali. What this basically, say again?
Yeah, I was just saying, yeah.
It's fun to say too, patent foramen ovali, right?
It's actually patent foramen. I thought it was foramen ovali, but everybody pronounces things differently, I guess.
Yeah, Foramen. I've heard it pronounced a couple different ways as well. I've always said foramen ovali.
I mean, you are talking to a nurse, you know.
Absolutely. I've heard it said a couple different ways, and I could be saying it wrong. But basically, what it is a hole in the heart that developed. It was from birth. And what happens is when the baby's born, there's a hole between the ventricles, right? And it eventually heals up naturally. But in about 1 out of 10 to 1 out of 20 people, it doesn't. And the problem is it allows the gas bubbles to travel between the chambers of the heart. And it causes what appears to be DCS. And the treatment, luckily, is the same as DCS, and get them to a doctor overall.
So in that case, if you know you kind of have that issue, like, don't dive, or is it just take extra stream, like way more deeper safety stops kind of scenarios, so that you can off gas it slower?
Nope. You go to the doctor and you get it sewed up. They literally go to heart surgery and they sew it up. And there's all kinds of cool ways that they do this kind of stuff nowadays. I have a friend that they put 7 stents, and not once did they cut it into his chest at all. He went in the morning, and by the afternoon he had 7 stents. They went through his leg and put 7 stents in. Never cracked his chest once. So there's modern surgery has gotten pretty freaking amazing. It blows me away every time I hear something cool like that. When Kelly told me that, literally, he went in at 7 o'clock in the morning to the emergency room. He was in the operating room at 10 a.m. He was out of the operating room at 2 o'clock, and they released him the next day.
Yeah,
That's
go
cool.
through that femoral artery.
It was cool. I mean, you guys and I are old enough to remember, though, when somebody went for stents, they were in the hospital for 2 weeks, right?
Mhm.
Not out the next day. Come on now. So pretty neat stuff. I've got a cool video for you guys on how the lungs work, and I really like this video. It's simple, and I like simple. So I figured you guys appreciate it too. And it's a TED Talk.
Many of us have hundreds of things on our minds at any moment, often struggling to keep track of everything we need to do. But fortunately, there's one important thing we don't have to worry about remembering: breathing. When you breathe, you transport oxygen to the body's cells to keep them working and clear your system of the carbon dioxide that they produce. Breathing, in other words, keeps the body alive. So how do we accomplish this crucial and complex task without even thinking about it? The answer lies in our body's respiratory system. Like any machinery, it consists of specialized components and requires a trigger to start functioning. Here, the components are the structures and tissues making up the lungs, as well as the various other respiratory organs connected to them. And to get this machine moving, we need the autonomic nervous system, our brain's unconscious control center for the vital functions. As the body prepares to take in oxygen-rich air, this system sends a signal to the muscles around your lungs, flattening the diaphragm and contracting the intercostal muscles between your ribs to create more space for the lungs to expand. Air then whooshes into your nose and mouth, through your trachea, and into the bronchi that's split at the trachea's base, with one entering each lung. Like tree branches, these small tubes divide into thousands of tinier passages, called bronchioles. It's tempting to think of the lungs as huge balloons, but instead of being hollow, they're actually spongy inside, with the bronchioles running throughout the parenchyma tissue. At the end of each bronchiole is a little air sac called an alveolus, wrapped in capillaries full of red blood cells containing special proteins called hemoglobin. The air you breathed in fills these sacs, causing the lungs to inflate. Here is where the vital exchange occurs. At this point, the capillaries are packed with carbon dioxide, and the air sacs are full of oxygen. Due to the basic process of diffusion, the molecules of each gas want to move to a place where there is a lower concentration of their kind. So as oxygen crosses over to the capillaries, the hemoglobin grabs it up, while the carbon dioxide is unloaded into the lungs. The oxygen-rich hemoglobin is then transported throughout the body via the bloodstream. But what do our lungs do with all that carbon dioxide? Exhale it, of course. The autonomic nervous system kicks in again, causing the diaphragm to ball up and the intercostal muscles to relax, making the chest cavities smaller and forcing the lungs to compress. The carbon dioxide-rich air is expelled, and the cycle begins again. So that's how these spongy organs keep our body efficiently supplied with air. Lungs inhale and exhale between 15 and 25 times a minute, which amounts to an incredible 10,000 liters of air each day. That's a lot of work, but don't sweat it. Your lungs and your autonomic nervous system have got it covered.
What do you guys think? Kind of a fun little video?
Yeah.
That's probably old hat for Megan. She's like, I could have wrote that. I could have done that one by myself. Not a problem at all. So overall, it's really interesting is how we breathe in. It goes down the trachea into the lungs, so the alveolars, and out into the system, right? And it goes out to the tissues, right? Then comes back up to the venous system and comes back in through the heart, and eventually is pumped into the lungs, and we exhale the carbon dioxide as we go along. It's definitely interesting process we go through. So there's several key parts of the cardiovascular system, and it consists of three major components. Megan, what are the three major components of the cardiovascular system?
Are you talking about the lungs, the arteries, and the veins? Or not the lungs, the heart, the arteries, and the veins? Or are you talking about
exactly. Well, the blood
Yeah.
and the venous system and the blood vessels. So we got the heart to pump it, the blood vessels to allow the plumbing, and the blood to transport the medium. That might be a test question, by the way. I try and throw as many test questions as I possibly can into the system.
I got that right on my test, so
Awesome. Have you guys taken the final exam?
not the final, no.
Okay. Not a worry. When
Just
you guys,
questions.
not a worry. If you guys have any hard time with the final exam, let me know, and we can absolutely schedule another session to go over anything that you're having a hard time with as we go through this process. So we talked a little bit, probably talked a lot about the effects of the temperature underwater as well. And we talked about hypothermia. And I just kind of want to reiterate, we've kind of gone through this and tied to it enough at this point, but I just want to really drive home that the idea of hypothermia is it's cumulative. And that's one of the things that we as cold water divers really need to take into consideration, right? And I can tell you from teaching ice diving over the course of a day, I can promise you hypothermia is absolutely cumulative, right? The last session I did last year, it would have been April of last year was my last session. I ended up with 2 hours of bottom time under the ice. And absolutely, I got out and I can tell you, it took me a good day and a half to get warm again, truthfully warm at the core, right? And I didn't take a hot bath. I did all the right stuff. I got hydrated. I warmed up slowly. But I promise you that fireplace in the living room was going full blast. it felt wonderful. So I feel like we've kind of hit that idea. And we've got a good idea of what hypothermia is as well. Let's see.
Probably more guilty than I should be on that. Like when we got on our dive trips, me and Megan have been bad about getting into the hot shower, washing off all the salt water, but the hot water has been our warm up before we go out and socialize. So it's probably not a good thing to do anymore, huh?
It's not. And interestingly enough, and I'm trying to remember the island, but there's a barotrauma specialist, and she's world renowned. She actually semi-retired to this island. And she wrote this wonderful paper, and I'll dig through and find it. But what she determined is when tourists came in that were divers, that were complaining of not quite feeling great, or having headaches, or being checked out after dive, she found that around 61% of her divers were actually experiencing mild forms of DCS.
Gotcha.
From coming in from a dive, diving too much, hot showers, hot tubs, all the above, too fast ascents, not watching their safety stops, all the above, right? All the common villains in this saga. But 61% had some form of DCS. Pretty huge.
In that state, like obviously when we get off the boat and then we're cold or whatever the case is, like, is it okay to do a lukewarm bath or warm shower?
Warm, yeah.
It's not hot.
Just not hot. Stick with warm. Take your time. Make sure you're well hydrated. Rest a little bit. Rinse off, and then a warm but not hot. I know how good a nice hot shower feels. I took a nice hot shower this morning. It was like, oh yeah. I'd gotten out and done some yard work early this morning and went upstairs and I took an extra 20-minute hot shower. It's like, oh yeah, this is so good.
So it's hard to decide if me and Meg have ever had like minor, decompression sickness, so to speak, because like when we get on our dives and stuff, when we're diving for that long and stuff, we're typically still a little bit tired afterwards. Sometimes we want to lay down and relax or lay down in bed and take a nap. But is that more just exhaustion from diving, or do you think potentially just like from being cold and then hot showers or whatever the case?
It's most likely a combination, to be truthful with you. Diving takes a lot out of you. That's one of the things that most people don't realize is a 50 to 60 minute dive at 60 feet is equal to a very, very brisk 5-mile walk or a a slow 5-mile run. That's about how much exertion and how many calories you're burning. And that's what people don't realize is they go through this process and they're exposing themselves to higher gas densities, bigger potentials, higher partial pressures of gas, other things as well. And so you start putting all this together. And for me, myself, and I, since I have my back issue, I haven't really exercised or worked out in about 6 months because, well, I'm lazy and fat, is the truth of the matter. And it wouldn't be any big deal for me to start working out again, but we fall in those sedimentary patterns, right? We're not lucky enough to be roofers and climb around on roofs and carry, 100-pound things with shingles to keep us in shape. Some of us have to sit in front of Zoom calls all day long, right? And deal with that. So it's really easy for us to get out of shape. And then all of a sudden we say, oh, hey, we're going to go on this 7-day trip and we're going to do 5 dives a day and da. Well, I mean, common sense tells you that if I haven't worked out in a year and I'm not in that great a shape to start with, and I suddenly decide that I'm going to go run 20 miles every day or right at the end of the 5 days, that I've got a pretty high likelihood of having a heart attack. It's not a big connection to connect the two. And then you start adding the idea of gas density, which I think I'm going to probably move over to gas density a little bit instead of over expansion injuries, because I know it's not something you guys have heard before, because most divers haven't. And right now, Dan is I've been working with Dan for about 6 months on this one, and I think they're tired of hearing from me, to be honest with you. But luckily, I don't. That's actually probably not true. But overall, I'm kind of the poster child for pushing that gas density is bad. And that we need to be extremely aware of this and start getting this message out to people. So let's start off with the idea of worker breathing is kind of the key point of this, and understanding what is worker breathing.
No idea.
So breathing is how hard you have to work to breathe?
Absolutely. So as we get deeper in the water column, the gas actually gets denser, right? So at the surface here, the gas that we're breathing is about 1.293 grams per liter of density. Okay, and we measure that the gas density in grams per liter. How many grams to a liter of gas? So 79%, 21% is about 1.293 grams per liter. Now, if we break this down, it's interesting to note that nitrogen has a weight by itself of 1.251 grams per liter, which is slightly less than the air we breathe. Now, oxygen has a gas density of 1.428 grams per liter. Now, you notice it's heavier than nitrogen. It's heavier than the gas we're breathing. So, as you might guess, as we start using a higher percentage of nitrox, the gas will become denser more quickly because oxygen is much heavier. Now, let's do some really quick, easy math. You guys got your calculators?
Get my phone.
Awesome. So if we're at 33 feet, 2 atmospheres, and gas, the air we're breathing 21%, how many grams per liter is air if it's 1.293 at the surface?
So that's just times 2.
Yep, just time 2.
2.586.
Absolutely. Now, interestingly enough, there was the University of New Zealand in Auckland did a study in conjunction with Scripps Institute. And what they determined is when gas density reaches a density of 5.2 grams per liter, that it starts becoming extremely dangerous. And that should be our limit for diving. 5.2 grams per liter. Now, you saw just getting to 33 feet, we got half of that, right? Very, very quickly, right?
Yeah.
Got kind of scary. Now, what they determined is that when it approached 6 grams per liter, that they had a 10% failure rate on all dives. And when they passed 6 grams per liter, that immediately jumped to 40% of dives failing or having issues. So what they did is they put the idea that you should never pass 5.2 grams per liter with a hard max of 6.2 grams per liter. Now let's do some math for a minute, just so we get a kind of a hard idea of this. And Adam, if I went to 99 feet, 4 atmospheres, what is the gas density if the air that I'm breathing is 1.293?
$5.172.
Absolutely. So on air, we're starting to already approach the maximum level at just 99 feet. Make sense?
Yeah.
So we're breathing in that. So here's what happens. If I have a heavy liquid, will it flow through a hose more easily than a light liquid? Like, exactly, right? So what ends up happening is as this gas density increases, it reduces our body's ability to exhale carbon dioxide from our lungs. And where it really gets scary is 60% of the oxygenation of our body comes from the bottom 30% of our lungs.
So that would be the hardest part to get out.
Exactly. So 60%. That's huge, right? That's like almost 2/3.
Which is why you dive flat. If you can, helps the air get out better.
It doesn't, unfortunately. The lungs expel what the lungs expel. So here's the problem, is if that's happening, what ends up is we have a buildup of carbon dioxide in our body. Kind of scary, right? And as that carbon dioxide builds up in our body, we start having bigger issues like confusion, disorientation. Does that sound like anything else that you may have heard of at depth?
Narcosis.
Yeah, right? So we've got this, it's called hypercapnia. And what you'll find is all the symptoms for hypercapnia and nitronarcosis are almost exactly the same. Here's the difference, is with hypercapnia, you also end up with a headache after a dive.
Well, and isn't with hypercapnia too, you get super red, which you don't with narcosis?
You can, but that's hard to tell because remember, you just got out of the water.
Yeah.
So it's extremely difficult to tell skin issue when you start talking about hypercapnia versus nitronarcosis in that setting, right? So as you start looking at this, hypercapnia and nitronarcosis mask each other very, very well. And most cases of people thinking they're getting nitronarcosis are actually getting hypercapnia. So let's put this more into, and I wrote an article for Dan, and you're welcome to read the article for Dan, but here's my scenario. There's a woman, we'll call her Janet. Janet is 55 years old. She's an office worker in mid-level management. Okay. Sound like anybody we know? Like about half the people we know, right?
Yeah.
So Janet had got certified to dive 15 years ago and decided that she saw an advertisement for a local dive shop that said they're going to, we'll say the Caribbean somewhere, right? Pick an island. I don't care. Jamaica? Sound good?
Sure.
Okay, so they're going to Jamaica and they're going to be there for 7 days. They're going to do 3-a-day dives. Okay. So they take, Janet comes to the local dive shop to do an update. And the dive shop says, hey, wait a minute. We're going to be doing some deep dives. We're also going to do some night dives. So you should take these classes before we leave next week. So they rush her through and they do all the dives for night dive and deep dive as well to rush her through this. Well, Janet's slightly overweight, a little bit high cholesterol as well, because she's an office worker and she's very efficient at the donut pool, right? Like all of us. I promise you, I'm a world champion donut eater, right? They take her on this trip and they take her out and they decide to do some deep dives and they're doing 3 days. On day 4, they decide to do 3 days. And on the 4th dive, they decided to go out and do a reverse profile on nitrox to 120 feet to see a wreck. Sound like it could be a little dangerous?
Definitely.
Reverse profile, that's your first problem.
Yep, absolutely. So they do this nitrox dive and they're diving 34%, right? And they decide a really good idea is to go to 108 feet on this dive. Well, the problem with that is nitrox at 34% at 108 feet is 5.51 grams per liter over the recommended amount. Janet is slightly overweight. She's not in any type of great physical shape. She's done a reverse profile, and now she's suffering from hypercapnia as well at the same time, and a very high work of breathing because the density of the gas is well above the recommended amount of 5.2.
Mm-hmm.
If she's having a hard time breathing, she's slightly out of shape, is it any stretch of the imagination to think that that could cause a cardiac event?
Absolutely.
Well, in this particular case, Janet suffered a cardiac event. The dive dive shop owner, instructor that was with her noticed that something was going wrong with Janet. Drug her to the surface, began rescue breathing. But the problem is they swam 300 yards off the shore to get to this wreck. He began rescue breaths and then drug her to shore, began CPR, called 911 at the or the resort helpline, whatever. Began CPR and Janet expired.
Well, he's also going to be exerting a ton of carbon dioxide, which he's already got too much of, as he's trying to help do rescue breathing too.
Absolutely. So he puts himself at risk as well. And unfortunately, in this case, that is not an uncommon story, has happened multiple times. And if you read through the Dan accidents, it's happened multiple times to multiple shops. Is it a stretch of the imagination to think that because she was well over the recommended amount of gas density, that the hypercapnia and the additional work of breathing triggered a cardiac event? It's not.
Makes sense.
It's very plausible.
It's very possible. Absolutely. So as you start looking at this, you start thinking, okay, yes, I'm diving nitrox, but am I creating more problems than I'm really helping? And you got to kind of weigh that out. And so I've got this really cool spreadsheet that I use, and I've spent a lot of time on the stupid spreadsheet. So don't judge me. I'm a spreadsheet guy. So as we look at this, we can start putting in some basic ideas. This is my gas planning software for hypercapnia and gas density. So if we wanted to do a dive, we're going to dive 36% nitrox to 108 feet in fresh water. That's 5.52 grams per liter. So I went ahead and put this chart together, and I'd be happy to send this to you as well. But
Yes.
This is my go, no go chart. On air, 21%, 85 feet is just fine for your gas density, for your partial pressure of oxygen, and your equivalent narcotic depth, where nitrogen can become narcotic. Once you pass 90 feet, we start getting to the point where your equivalent narcotic depth starts to become dangerous, and you need to definitely be aware of that. Your partial pressure is fine, and your gas density is starting to gain in density as well. So on just air at 105 feet, you've already passed the recommended 5.4 grams per liter, and you're definitely in narcotic zone as well. But you think, wait a minute, what about EAN 28? Okay, let's look at that. Your gas density, you hit 5.26, so you hit your gas density a lot more quickly. You need to be aware of that. EAN 32, at that same depth of 100 feet, you're now at 5.29 grams per liter, so you're even more than 28. 36%, 5.32 liters. If you're breathing 40% nitrox, you're going to hit your gas density limit at around 95 feet. So it doesn't take a lot. And this is, this is my own chart, but it gives you an idea of, in dark red is your death zone, dark red death zone, dark red death zone. But it gives you an idea of where you can be safe, all in green, based upon 21%, 28%, 32%, 36%, and so on. This is where it really gets interesting. This is why one of the reasons we do trimix. So in the same scenario, if I was diving 36% oxygen and I was diving 30% helium, you can see is substantially lighter. That same dive now becomes very safe, 4.17 grams per liter. So there's your argument for why helium in trimix is a wonderful saver, and why there's less cardiac events, people diving trimix, than there is people diving nitrox or air.
And it looks to be as hydrogen
hydrogen is a really interesting one as well. Hydrogen is super light. Right now, there's only 3 recorded dives on hydrogen, so it's a really interesting thing to talk about and to theorize about. The problem with hydrogen is that when you mix it with more than 4% oxygen, it becomes highly explosive.
Yeah.
So it's for ultra deep diving is what they're experimenting on. And here's your fun story for the day. So one of the guys that is experimenting with, his name's Richard Harris. And this guy is an absolute diving god when it comes down to it. He's done big dives, long dives, deep dives, cave dives. He's the guy. He was also he was also the anesthetician for the Thai rescue divers. In case you had trying to figure out, where did I hear that name before? But Richard Harris decided he wanted to experiment with hydrogen. He said the first thing was interesting. He says, you know how you get a bottle of hydrogen? You call up Norco and give them your credit card. They send you over a bottle of nitrogen. Or hydrogen, I'm sorry, not nitrogen, hydrogen. He says, all you need is a credit card and a delivery address. They'll send it over to you. He says, the next thing he did is he mixed it into a bottle for his rebreather. And then he decided his concern is that if it got into the bellows and the counterlung of the rebreather, it's dry and it's canvas in there, it could have caused a spark. There's also an oxygen sensor in the counterlung as well that measures the percentage of oxygen in there as well, and it can cause a spark as well. Either of which can cause this to blow up. And it's highly explosive, right? And so
like what parts in the dive setup would actually be potentially causing a spark?
Well, in a rebreather, that's a big deal, right? That's actually something that can happen pretty easily. So his brilliant idea, you'll love this, Megan, his idea how he decided to test this is he gets it mixed up and he sends his wife with a credit card to the mall to go shopping and then puts it in the pool, starts it up and runs and hides behind the garage to make sure that if it blew up, he'd be safe. So his brilliant idea was send the wife shopping so I can test it in the pool. They tested it on a cave in New Zealand, and they did one dive, and the results were very promising. That they noticed that they didn't get high pressure nervous system disorder when they switched to hydrogen, and they were able to dive deeper. They noticed the same thing when they did Bozeman's Gat about a week ago, that they didn't get high pressure nervous system disorder from hydrogen as well. So it's very promising, but the trick is how do you mix it? How do you keep from blowing yourself up, right? So you literally solving one problem by creating a whole nother one. So interesting enough. So that's where hydrogen comes in, and that's kind of your interesting off track. But overall, I want you guys to be aware of that as you get deeper, the gas is going to get denser. And as this gas gets denser, you've got to reduce your workload dramatically. Because as this carbon dioxide builds up and this hypercapnia starts to build up in you, the more you cause your heart to work to create motion and breathe, the more susceptible to hypercapnia you're going to be, as well as the more susceptible to a high work of breathing and a heart attack you're going to have. There's a really great movie. If you guys want to watch a great one, Dave Not Coming Home. It's free. It's on YouTube. That's exactly what happened. Is Dave went into a cave at 900 feet in a place called Bozeman's Gat in South Africa. It's 5,000 foot elevation, and lost his rope and got tangled for a second. And because of that, went into hardcore hypocapnia, passed out, and had a cardiac event and died. It's a great movie, though. It really is. I enjoyed it thoroughly. But it was because of a high work of breathing and high gas density. So be really careful when you start doing these deep dives. Be aware that there's more at stake than just nitrogen narcosis. There's more at stake than just oxygen toxicity in CNS, right? Yeah. There's a whole nother thing that nobody's talking about, and they're just starting to come out and start talking about, and I'm one of the few people that right now are talking about gas density in recreational diving. It's absolutely a thing. Be aware, it's definitely of concern.
It's the unspoken part that nobody talks about. But again, recreational diving, nobody really dives that deep, except for in the Caribbean. You see like 100 and I think deepest me and Megan's gone like 105 feet.
But even at 105 feet on air, at 105 feet, you're at 5.41 grams per liter on air.
Well, and we're usually on nitrox, so we're already past where we should be.
Absolutely. If you're on 32% nitrox, you're at 5.49 grams per liter. So you're above that.
That's what I found interesting. I'm like, yep, that's why it always, like, I feel it probably more than Adam does, is how hard it feels to breathe when we are that deep.
And
I don't
a lot of that's because of the gas density. It's scary.
Exactly.
So be aware. Absolutely. Well, perfect. I've got a really cool video as we kind of move along. Let's move along into air gas embolisms. I've got a really cool doctor for you here that I really like. I just need to change my share here. Share screen. What you can't see is I have 4 screens going. I'm that big a nerd.
Uh-huh.
I have 3. You're fine.
There you go. Yeah, I've got one on either side of me, one up here, and then I've got another one off to the right here. I put my text messages and my messages on the far one, so I don't have to look at them. And then I do all my stuff on these. It's awesome. I'm a nerd though. I love it. All right, arterial gas embolisms. I like this guy.
All right, now let's talk about
Can't hear him very good though.
arterial gas embolism or air gas embolism or cerebral arterial gas embolism. So embolism just means something floating in your blood. And if we're talking about an arterial gas embolism, we're talking about gas in the artery. So you got a bubble that's flowing in the artery, and it's made of air. It's made of the air that you're breathing. This is not a pure nitrogen problem like people are saying. This is a mechanical problem where a bubble gets into the wrong circulation. Most of the time, it will go to the head, to the brain, and that's a cerebral air gas embolism or arterial gas embolism, some people call it. And so we call it CAGE, C-A-G-E. And if that happens, it causes the stroke phenomenon. How does it happen? Well, we think that the majority of the time it comes with a pulmonary overinflation syndrome. In other words, as you're coming up in the water column, you're finished your dive, you're ascending, you know you're supposed to exhale and let a free flow of air come out so you're not trapping, expanding air in your lungs, but sometimes things happen. You know, in the last 20 feet of your dive is the biggest volume of air expansion, and you might be in rough seas and you're bobbing 6-7 feet in between breaths. Maybe you're just not thinking. Maybe you've run out of air underwater and you're bolting to the surface and you panic and you're clamping down. Now, the expanding air in your lungs may shear the inner lining of your lung and let air track along that circulation. It gets here towards the heart. It may cross over, get into the circulation going out of the heart, and boom, the circulation going into the brain. All of a sudden, you've got a small bubble, maybe the size of the head of this pin. Maybe that big, but it's a small bubble. But if it's in an artery that supplies blood to your brain, that's a real problem. And you can get a massive stroke phenomenon that paralyzes part of your body that causes you to be unconscious or almost immediately dead. These things do happen. Or more insidiously, you might get a very small bubble that just starts to starve a small part of the brain to oxygen. You might have very subtle symptoms. Loss of a visual field, you see on one side. Perhaps a loss of balance, you become dizzy. Maybe you have loss of motor control of an arm or a muscle group. Maybe you have a loss of sensation or a change in the way you think or speak or any of these subtle findings. Now, with any arterial gas embolism, the good news is, even though it acts like a stroke, treating a normal stroke, a blood clot stroke, is difficult. You've got to try to get some clot-busting medications or some blood thinning medications on board some of the time. This may be very dangerous. The good thing is if we get gas embolism in the brain into the chamber within a few hours, we're usually going to do normal brain, normal tissue. And the time to treatment is tissue in this regard. Probably have at the outside about a 5-hour window, but hopefully we want to get the patient sooner than that. We need to get that air gas embolism treated as soon as possible, restore blood flow, crush that bubble down, let blood start moving through that artery, bringing oxygen to that part of the brain that may be dying, but it's still salvageable, and get that back together. So, if someone has a big arterial gas embolism and they're paralyzed or nearly unconscious or fully unconscious, you're going to recognize this. That's a no-brainer. We're going to have to get the emergency system activated. But if it's a smaller gas embolism, a very small bubble, and it causes a very
city has changed. That's where we've got to be heads up for each other. We've got to be heads up to divers. We've got to look out for each other.
2006. Dr. Benjamin 2006.
We've got to look out for each other. We've got to our divers in our group, especially if we're new to each other. And we need to have people understand what we're like, what our normal neurological function is. I don't ask recreational or civilian divers to be expert neurological examiners. Now, in Navy diving, there are very strict standards, and all Navy divers learn a fundamental neurological exam before you go underwater. Any Navy diving, you're going to be by the book. There's an entire sweep of the crew. The dive sup is looking at each person. Afterwards, the dive supervisor is going to look at each person again, each diver, check to see that they're clear, watch them for 15 minutes. We don't do this in civilian diving, even organizational diving. But what I do ask us all to do is pay attention to safety, and we'll talk about that in another video. But the culture of safety means we're not afraid to ask other divers to know who we are, and pay attention to us, and in turn, we're good buddies to other divers, and we're going to say to them, hey, I know what you look like, what you normally are, and if you're not acting right, I'm going to get help for you. Because, say with arterial gas embolism, cerebral arterial gas embolism, first of all, if you're having a stroke type activity in the brain, you don't know it. You may have lost a whole arm function and not know it, and your brain will turn off awareness that while that part of the brain is dying. So you can ask a stroke patient, hey, will you move your right arm for me? And the person may move their left arm and think they're doing the command. So a diver who has a gas bubble in the brain and is losing function in the brain may not know they're in trouble. So we have to look out for each other. And also, of course, divers like to minimize symptoms. I know this, so say that I would be above it sometimes when I'm all excited about diving as well. But divers tend to minimize symptoms and try to keep going, and we really have to pay attention to that problem in the brain. So arterial gas embolism is associated with being the first 15 minutes or so after you come up. That's not absolute. It tends to be a faster onset. In decompression sickness, it tends to be related to pulmonary overinflation, and it's an air bubble, the air that you're breathing, not a nitrogen saturation in this problem. Treatment at the scene, of course, is airway, oxygen, CPR if necessary, and rapid transport to a hyperbaric medicine facility with emergency capability.
Okay, it's not Lucy. There we go. Pretty interesting. I kind of cover a little bit more about arterial gas embolism. Make more sense?
Yep.
Absolutely. I think we've done a really good job on everything else. I've got another couple of videos to go through. I've got one more video that I'd like to share, and then we'll talk more. This one should be on DCS.
Prior to COVID-19.
My name is Roland Arms, and I am a consultant in diving and hyperbaric medicine. I have been asked to speak to you about the signs and symptoms of decompression illness. First, I'd like to address some terminology because this can be confusing. Decompression illness can be split into two groups of conditions. Decompression sickness, which is commonly known as the bends, and arterial gas embolism. And I'll describe both of these in detail in a moment. There are another group of conditions that can affect divers related to what is called barotrauma. So that is injury caused to divers by changes in pressure. And some symptoms that will present after a dive lead to a diagnosis of barotrauma. If we go back to decompression sickness, the bends, and arterial gas embolism first, it's important to understand the timing of onset of a diver's symptoms. If symptoms present in a very short space of time after a diver has surfaced from their last dive, like say within 5 to 10 minutes, then there is likely to be a component of arterial gas embolism affecting that diver. Even if there is no arterial gas embolism, then decompression sickness symptoms can present as early as 20 minutes after surfacing from their last dive, or the presentation may be delayed until up to 3 days after the dive. Very rarely it is possible to see decompression sickness present even later than that. The symptoms of arterial gas embolism and decompression sickness do overlap. If we go back to the beginning and address barotrauma first of all, chest pain and shortness of breath are very uncommon features of the BENS, decompression sickness, or arterial gas embolism, and are much more likely to represent either an injury that has occurred to the diver whilst diving, or specifically be symptoms of barotrauma. So that is a very important distinction to make. We now consider the symptoms that may represent arterial gas embolism or decompression sickness, the BENS. I'll break them down into related clusters of symptoms. So divers may experience undue tiredness, lethargy, poor appetite, and just generally not feel very well. And those are described as constitutional symptoms of decompression sickness or arterial gas embolism. We may see a diver present with joint pain, which is quite common and often is an isolated symptom that can be related to others. Divers may present with an unusual rash, which may in addition be associated with skin edema and swelling. And that is a common presentation of decompression sickness. And then we have a cluster of neurological symptoms. So a diver may present with weakness, numbness, tingling, or other subjective neurological symptoms. And all of these would point towards a neurological episode of decompression sickness or the BENS. Symptoms of great significance to us are what we call girdle pain, when a diver experiences pain radiating around from the back, around both sides of their body, or indeed back pain. Those might be cardinal symptoms of a spinal decompression sickness or BENS. And that is really important for us to understand. Another group of symptoms that divers may get relate to poor balance. So they may be unable to stand, or they may have been able to walk after the dive, but their balance may deteriorate. Along with that, they may experience dizziness, possibly even true vertigo, and they may be very nauseated or indeed have vomited. All of those symptoms would suggest the development of an element of a vestibular episode of decompression sickness or the BENS. Loss of consciousness, outright cardiovascular collapse, and unilateral arm and leg weakness are uncommon presentations, but the differential diagnosis for those would be an arterial gas embolism if those symptoms arose very quickly after a diver surfaced. But we also have to consider that divers may become unwell for other reasons whilst diving that are unrelated to pressure changes and breathing compressed gas. By this I mean that a diver may experience a heart attack, a stroke, subarachnoid hemorrhage, or have some other significant medical event whilst diving that may result in the symptoms that present thereafter. We also have to consider that divers can become injured physically whilst diving. So if a diver presents after a dive with musculoskeletal pain, numbness in a limb, or backache, then these symptoms may relate to musculoskeletal injury that has occurred whilst they've been diving, and they may remember that injury happening. But we have to be cautious of these symptoms, especially if it relates to back pain or girdle pain or significant major joint pain, because differential diagnosis for those is a significant episode of decompression sickness.
Makes sense.
What do you guys think? I like him, and he definitely brings up some interesting ideas of when DCS happens as well. We kind of touched on that. So DCS typically starts presenting at least 15 to 17 minutes after a dive. So if we start noticing DCS symptoms at the 5-minute mark, I thought it was interesting that he notes that this is probably mixed in with AGE, right? And some sort of embolism as well. Makes sense? Absolutely. Well,
Yep.
perfect. Well, we talked a lot tonight, and this is kind of the scary night over all things. The last thing I kind of want to talk a little bit about is CNS oxygen toxicity and pulmonary oxygen toxicity. And we'll end there. And that'll make tomorrow night's session more review and a little bit of fish and wildlife. So oxygen toxicity, do you have any idea, Megan, when we started first talking about and studying oxygen toxicity? What year? You muted yourself.
As far as like the people that started researching it?
Huh?
No, I don't.
1899, Dr. J. Lorraine Smith first described the signs and symptoms and effects of oxygen toxicity in the lungs. And we start talking about oxygen toxicity in lungs, we're really talking about pulmonary oxygen toxicity, right? The OTU, right? Or and as we measure this and we start getting more advanced diving, we actually call it the POT, pulmonary oxygen toxicity, or the POT. I love that they call it that. But he noted that the severity of the effects increased with increasing partial pressure effects were largely reversible. And that pulmonary oxygen toxicity typically happen when we breathe partial pressures between 0.45 and 1.6, okay? And those are primarily in the lungs. So the toxic effects at partial pressure at 1.6 and above are primarily in the brain. That's where we start getting into CNS. So as we kind of talk about pulmonary oxygen toxicity, you being a nurse, Megan, you've probably seen some of this. When somebody's on oxygen for a long period of time, they start getting pulmonary oxygen toxicity. They start developing irritation in the throat, right? And it's made worse by breathing more, right? And deep breathing as well. You probably noticed people on oxygen for long periods of time also start developing a cough. Have you seen that before? Absolutely. Mm-hmm. They're starting to get pulmonary oxygen toxicity. The good news is it's largely reversible. Now, as it starts getting worse, this is followed by a more irritated cough, and breathing becomes painful. The cough can actually become uncontrollable. Some other things that they'll notice is tightness in the chest, difficulty breathing, and shortness of breath. If this happens long enough, pulmonary oxygen toxicity can actually result in death from lack of oxygen. What we're literally doing is we're overwhelming the hemoglobin barrier in the lung structure past the alveolar to the point where it cannot allow oxygen to pass. It just says, too much. I give up, right? There's not that any of us have ever gotten to that point with anybody and said, I'm done with this crap, right? That's basically what's happening is it gets too much, right? So the good news is on pulmonary oxygen toxicities, the average adult, based upon these studies, can tolerate around 12 hours of 100% oxygen, about 14 hours at 1.5, and about 3 hours at 200% oxygen before pulmonary oxygen toxicity symptoms start to show. Now, there's several ways to track oxygen toxicity, but Adam, do you know the number one way to determine if somebody has pulmonary oxygen toxicity?
What the number one way would be to detect it?
Yep.
No, I don't remember. It's something to do with they're not acting right, or they could potentially pass out or something like that.
Now remember, we're talking about pulmonary oxygen toxicity.
Okay, yeah. Then teach me then.
Absolutely. The good news is this: the answer is always simple in this kind of stuff. It's when they start developing symptoms, coughs, dryness, chest pains, things like that. That's the absolute positively number one way to start determining if somebody's developing pulmonary oxygen toxicity. Now, you can go into a vital capacity test. And what we notice is that a reduction of about 2% in vital capacity correlates with a reduction of 10% of the symptoms, right? And that's where we start getting to that point of reduction of ability. So 2% vital capacity results in 10% capacity lost. And that's where it gets bad. And the good news is these are mostly reversible, and most damage will take about 2 to 4 weeks, and it'll completely repair itself. The lungs are pretty freaking amazing, right? Overall. Now, one of the things as we kind of go through this, it's interesting to kind of notice as we start talking about things like vital capacity checks. We've all done this. I've done this. You've done this. Megan, you've done this. We've all gone and got our dive physical. We've gone to a GP who has zero understanding of how the lungs work under pressure, because that's not his field of study, right? You certainly wouldn't want a neurologist doing heart surgery, right?
Right.
Is that a fair estimate? Well, a GP has got general information on the body, but in terms of specifics on how pressure works on the lungs is probably not the best thing. So it's pretty rare to go do a dive physical where they actually give you a vital capacity check. Wouldn't that seem like a pretty good idea if you're going to be breathing compressed gas that's going to get dense, to understand how your lungs are going to be affected and if they're going to be affected, other than just, I hear your heartbeat, breathe in, breathe out. You might want to test that out. So I encourage you, when you guys go to do a dive physical, find a more specialized doctor that will be able to give you a test for vital capacity as well. So the other side of this is central nervous system toxicity. This is long exposures or high pressures of partial pressure of oxygen. Oh, got the kitty. Lucy would just love to play with her kitty, I'm sure. But as we start going through central nervous system oxygen toxicity, there's a few things to look for. And this is what you were thinking about, Adam. And that's when we start getting into convented convulsions, vision distortion, tunnel vision, ears, nausea, twitching, irritability, and dizziness. Now, I've said this before, and I'll say it again, is that diving is the most self-aware sport that I am absolutely positively aware of. How we feel going in the water is how we should feel coming out of the water. As we come out of the water, we should feel about the same. If we have joint pains, aching, vision issues, we're feeling sick to our stomach, that's our body trying to tell us something ain't right, right? I'm going to put you guys on mute for just 1 second. Oh, sorry, Alexa was trying to turn my lights off. So be aware. And as we start looking at this, Megan, you and Adam dive a lot together. Start looking at your diver after he gets out of the water. Start noticing things. Is he stumbling? Is he seem dizzy? Is he a little nauseous? Is he starting to have seizures of some kind? Is he slurring his speech? All these are him trying to unconsciously tell you, hey, something ain't right, hon. I might have a problem. And same thing with you, Adam. You should absolutely be looking at Megan and getting an idea, where is she at? And you certainly don't have to go to the point of doing a physical neurological exam right from the book, but it's certainly not a bad idea to take a look at her. And it's one of the things I've taken the habit. Before Nikki and I get in the water, I always do a dive check on her. I'm usually the one that hooks up her dry suit hose. I always make sure the dry suit hose works. I always make sure I give a puff on her gas, and I always make sure her gas is on. So I check things as I go out, but as we come out of the water, we do the same thing. I take a look at her. I talk to her. Now, there are times, we finished a 3-hour dive in Yellowstone one time, and we had a long-ass walk through 4 feet of water, and she was tired. I was tired. And when I offered to take one of her tanks and she yelled at me, I wasn't too terribly surprised that she said, get the hell away from me, leave me alone. I get it, right? But we definitely talk, and I get the idea, and she does the same thing for me. Is Benjamin acting strange? Is there something unusual? Is stumbling? Is he slurring his speech? Is there something off about him, right? We actually had that happen about 2 years ago. I got hypothermia really bad. I had a leak in my dry suit. I dove for too long. I tried the Superman thing and ended up with hypothermia. And she noticed this. And as we got out, and she realized and to see some of the signs and symptoms that my speech wasn't as coherent as it could have been. I wasn't able to come up with cognitive thoughts as clearly as I'd like to have. She noticed this, and she helped me get to the truck, helped me get my gear off, and then proceeded to chew me out for the next 10 minutes because I was being an idiot, which is just fine, right? When she figured out what was going on. But she got me warm and took care of me. So as you guys go through this, the biggest thing I can tell you is be aware, be safe. Smart diving is just good diving, right? Extra safety stops, slow ascents, watching your body decompression, taking the time to do those things. Not diving beyond your training, your ability, your limits. Don't do reverse profiles. Little things like that. It sounds simple, but we all know personally divers that don't do that kind of stuff. We all personally know divers that are at the instructor level that think it's okay to do half of their dives on a vacation going into deco. Well, I'm an instructor. I must know what I'm doing. I know those instructors, right? And I think, gosh, you have no training in this. You don't have a full understanding of what you're doing, and you're not geared for it either. Why would you do it? So take the time to be within the safety margins. This is not a sport for daredevils, right? There's old divers and there's bold divers, but there's no old bold divers, right? So it's one of those things. Before I was really into scuba diving, I was really into skydiving as well. And there was bold skydivers and there was old skydivers, but there was no old bold skydivers, right? But they tend to make a bigger splat. So as you kind of go through this process, so take the time and stay within safety limits and don't be daredevil. There's plenty of ocean, plenty of things to see, and plenty of cool things. That's really what I want to impart with you. So as we kind of go through this, I've got a few questions, and then we will call it an evening. I'll even pull the questions up for you. Megan, as you dive deeper, the narcotic effect of nitrogen can get
Greater.
Absolutely. Good job. Adam, which of the following statements concerning heat stroke is not true?
Following statements concerning heat stroke.
Heat stroke. I figured you probably knew some of this stuff, so I figured I'd skip a little bit of it.
That not true?
Is not true.
Well, I would guess it's the pulse is rapid, but I'm not sure about that one because
Perspiration increases.
Absolutely. Once you get into full heat exhaustion, you perspire, but at heat stroke, you stop perspiring.
oh yeah, because you just perspire when you're too hot, so it helps you cool down.
Exactly. Megan, this should be an easy one for you. How many pairs of sinuses do you have?
4.
Exactly.
What? How many pairs of sinuses does a person have?
Sinuses?
You've got your nasal sinuses and your ear sinuses.
Oh, okay, because they're all connected. That makes sense. I didn't know that.
Oh, I should have covered that more deeply. And Adam, which of the following symptoms which is not a symptom of decompression sickness or DCS?
Let's see.
Exactly. Now, Megan, what is cyanosis? There's 2 different conditions I can think of that would cause cyanosis. What are they?
Hypoxia
Mm-hmm.
and hypercapnia. The skin gets red, so it's not that.
Brr.
Oh yeah, you're cold.
It's late. I get it.
Yeah.
All right. Adam, hypothermia means a lower than normal.
Total body temperature, core temperature, body core temperature.
Body core temperature is exactly right. So, Megan, a physiological condition called a squeeze occurs when
The pressure on the outside is greater than the internal pressure.
Exactly. All right. This is kind of a tricky one. And this on the old test, it was different, but this is the new test, and I didn't cover this, but we'll see if you get it. Megan, a permanent hearing loss, vertigo, ringing in the ears are most likely a result of a ruptured
Round or oval window.
Exactly. Good job. All right. Adam, the primary symptom of ear squeeze in its initial phase is
It's a pressure will progress, pain equalize, not completed.
ding, ding, ding. Very good. All right. Megan, there are several overexpansion injuries caused by air expanding the lungs beyond their capacity that you should be aware of so that you can avoid them while diving. These are
D.
decompression sickness.
Oh, yeah. No. Over air expanding lungs beyond the capacity.
Yes.
Air embolism, metastyle emphysema, subcutaneous emphysema, and pneumothorax.
Exactly. We talked a lot about AGE. Metacymal emphysema is where air escapes the lungs into the chest cavity, the metacymal cavity. It's generally characterized by a a difference in size in the chest cavity. So you'll see literally one side of the chest cavity will look like it's indented, and it causes pressure on the heart and lungs and causes the heart not to be able to beat because of too much air pressure. It can only be fixed with a needle decompression, which you should not do. You cannot do because you're not certified. So the treatment for that is put them on oxygen, call 911, and treat for shock. Subcutaneous emphysema is where gas breaks the lung structure and it gets trapped between the chest cage and the subcutaneous layer, the skin, and generally presents by puffing around the neck, puffing in the lips, and puffing around the eyes. And pneumothorax is where air gets trapped in the throat cavity around the throat and causes you to have a difficulty breathing. So those are but the thing about it is metacymal emphysema, subcutaneous emphysema, and pneumothorax are extremely, extremely rare and generally more often caused by sudden impacts or orthopedic surgery. So arterial gas embolism is a more common presentation, but it's still one of the least common dive maladies out there. So I love that they talk about them. I wonder sometimes why we talk about them. Adam, if you have difficulty equalizing pressure in your ears or sinuses while descending, you should do what?
Ascend until the pressure's relieved, and then attempt re-equalization.
Oh, very good. Now, I know we talked about this. Megan, if a diver suffers decompression sickness in a remote location, you should never
Take them under the water.
Exactly. And the reason we know that they're suffering from decompression symptoms is because they've presented symptoms. So that's how we know. This is one of my favorite ones to say. Adam, hypoxic hypoxia is by far the most common form of hypoxia. This condition is when, and remember, hypoxic.
Hypoxic.
So lack of oxygen.
The lack of oxygen.
Mhm.
So it's A then.
Yeah, when the partial pressure oxygen in the arterial gas embolism is too low.
Yeah.
Megan, when oxygen pressure in the body drops below partial pressure of 0.17, mild symptoms of hypoxia occur. Blackout and death may occur when the partial pressure of oxygen drops below
D 0.10 ATA.
10%. Exactly.
Can you go back over that one for me? Sometimes when there's
Absolutely. So we're breathing 21%. We talked about this last night a little bit. So we're breathing 21%. When we get down to 16 to 17% partial pressure of oxygen, high altitudes, for example, or a lack of oxygen in our gas supply, we start feeling the symptoms of hypoxia where we lose coordination, disorientation, things like that, lack of ability to work. We can also come into the point where we can faint or have mild hypoxic symptoms. When the partial pressure of oxygen gets below 10% or 0.1 ATA.
Okay, so this was below. Okay, so sometimes the numbers throw me around when they put 0.17. It's technically 17% or 10% ATA.
Exactly.
Sometimes that just throws me off when they put it in decimal point versus percentage. So I was just
So if you breathe less than 10% oxygen, you're definitely in a bad place.
Right. Now it makes sense. Sorry. I when I saw 0.17, I'm like, AT, what? I'm confused. I thought it was percent, but I just got to do the manual conversion.
Exactly. No worries. It's all good. And finally, Adam, a possible source of contaminated air in a scuba cylinder is?
All of them.
All of them is exactly right. Guys, we've gone through quite a bit this evening, and I've kind of jumped around a little bit, but you guys are so sharp that I know you got it. We've gone through some decompression theory tonight. We talked about Haldane. We talked about Workman. We talked about M value already. Made it very easy on that. We re-explained half times. We've gone through last night. We went through Henry's law. Tonight we went through gas absorption and absorption as well. We've gone through everything. The only thing we didn't talk about tonight that is kind of on the list is flying after diving. One of the things that happens, just like coming up in the water column too quickly, if we fly after dive, we have nitrogen left in our bodies still. So Dan recommended recommends that we wait at least 24 hours after our last not recreational dive to fly. That gives our body enough time to allow the nitrogen to pass completely so we don't get the bends by getting on the plane. Now, if you're doing a big dive week and you're doing 3 days, 4 days, and they're big dives, take a little extra time and give your body the time to allow all the gas to completely happen. As they talked about it with DCS, sometimes DCS symptoms can take 2 to 3 days to fully present.
Yeah.
So it's not a bad idea after a big dive week to take a little extra time. Explore the island. There's always cool stuff there to explore. Take your time.
So I'm out of curiosity. I guess at one point in time, I want to learn more again. I think there's actually a class on it, but diving at altitude makes a big change, and I need to refresh on some of that stuff.
It does make a big change. I actually teach that class, and I'd love to work on that specialty with you. I've got a fantastic class on that. Turn the lights back on in my office. There we go.
I remember that's like the same concepts because me and Megan dove at Homestead Crater. We were at altitude. Effects of going down altitude or going over a pass and then back down could potentially
over altitude. Well, altitude has several effects. One of them is the length of your decompression time, or the speed of your. I'm sorry, not the length of your decompression time, but the speed at which you approach the non-decompression limits. The depths that you can dive are the two biggest factors involved with that. And then, so if you ascend after a dive, you need to make sure you're giving yourself a surface interval prior to ascending after a dive at altitude, because it's the same thing as getting on a plane. You've got to let that nitrogen come out. You also need to be aware that if you ascend to altitude for a dive, it's the same as ascending in the water column. You're got nitrogen trapped in your system. So any dive you do after ascending to altitude for a dive is the same as doing a repetitive dive.
Okay, so as you always preach, you say in layman's terms are diving practical. So like we said, we were diving at Homestead Crater, and it's like, what is it considered, a 60-foot dive?
It's going to be equal to, at that point, it's going to be equal to a 78-foot dive.
So that's what you consider it being, is a 70-foot essential dive because of the atmospheric.
Absolutely. Now the nice thing is your computer will adjust for this, and it'll compensate for that, provided you've set your computer correctly. Now, a lot of computers do that automatically, but some computers like the Sunto have to be manually set for altitude for it to get close to the correctness on that as well. The Shearwater absolutely automatically corrects. So the Garmin, the Ratio, the Apex DSX, all automatically correct for that. The Sunto does not have an automatic correction for that. You have to go in and set the altitude.
And it doesn't necessarily do good altitude adjustments either. It's very broad. It's like from zero.
What it's doing is it's tuning in the altimeter and actually more accurately the barometer within the computer, so that it's able to more accurately read between those. So if you set it to this, what it's doing is it's targeting in the barometer to look for everything this without creating too broad a range, and then it adjusts accordingly within that range.
Okay. So there's a little bit more back end of it that I didn't know.
Absolutely. So that's basically what's going on for you. Sunto is very interesting, that's for sure. It's not my favorite dive computer, but it's not my least favorite dive computer either. So
yeah,
I have a Sunto Black, their Pro Tech version, right? And like 3 or 4 pods. So
well, I bought Nikki's old one from you, so
yep. I have the step up from that one that's designed more for tech. But that Sunto that you have is a great computer for mid-level divers. Absolutely, it'll keep you very safe if you follow what it tells you to do.
Yep.
That's what I like about it. So it's a good computer, that's for sure.
Well, the one I want to get next is DSX. I think that would probably next suit me. Would you think that would be best suited for me for tech diving stuff later?
I love the DSX is a very good computer. Absolutely. There is talk that Brett is going to be bringing in the ratio as well. The ratio will be a little less expensive and would be a fantastic computer as well. That's what this is. Ratio from Italy sent this to me for some dive testing, so in reviews. But good computer. I dove it this weekend, and I'm going to dive it again this weekend. I was supposed to do a video dive test of it this week. I just didn't have time. I don't know, with not working, I fill my time with other crap. So I haven't figured that out. But there's several good computers out there. The DSX, I have a DSX. So if you want to check it out and see what it's all about, I'd be happy to go through it with you. I've got mine set up in side mount mode. Not that big a deal. Good computer, very simple. I even have I have a video of the top computers if you're interested. Let's see here. I would encourage you take a look at it. Your videos. I've got 5 computers on this video. There it is, right there. I've got the DSX, the Shearwater, the Garmin, the Suunto Black, and the Apple Watch. I took them all the way through a deco dive.
Okay.
So you can see what they all look like. Let's see. Private chat. There you go. There's a full dive with 5 different computers, including the Apple Watch Ultra 2.
Perfect.
So, been a pretty popular little video for us. And I go through so you can see what they all look like. The DSX did a great job. The Perdix did exactly what it was supposed to do. The Suunto Black did what I expected it to do. So it's more conservative. Good computer. Guys, we went through a lot. What questions do you have?
None at the moment, but I'm sure when we go start doing review stuff, I'm going to have questions. So
Absolutely. All right. Tomorrow night is the easy night. We're going to go through the total diving system. We're going to talk about simplicity of the diving system, consistency, adaptability, reliability, and redundancy. We'll talk a little bit about different types of equipment, cylinders, ratings, things like that, different types of regulators. We'll talk about comfort design, icing for cold water. I'll briefly touch on full face masks. If you haven't had a chance to dive a full face mask, it's fun. I enjoy mine quite a bit. We'll talk a little bit about weighting systems. We'll go through a little bit more functionality of computers as well. Let's see. Talk a little bit more about exposure suits, dive checks, and then we'll get a little in. I don't like to go too much into it because I feel like you could read more about it. But we'll talk about currents, longshore currents, short-shore currents, things like that. Terrain underwater. We'll get a little bit in that. It's a little bit of aquatic life. And then we'll finish up with preparation of and first aid for things caused by marine injuries. So puncture wounds, things like that. So tomorrow's the easy night. If you read your material, you probably know just about as much as I do on some of this stuff anyway. So, but I believe firmly, keep it simple, stupid is a good way to go.
perfect.
What did you guys learn tonight?
Oh, there was a lot. It was mostly at the beginning. Oh, Megan's writing, checking her notes.
Hey, what was the most interesting thing you learned this evening?
Probably the gas density and the fact that we have been diving past where we really should be diving.
Most divers do, and they don't realize it. And again, to be really clear on this, is I'm probably one of the very few people that's talking about this. I've been in discussions with Dan, and Dan is working on bringing this because of the red flag I'm waving on this, bringing it into the agencies. The challenge here, and this is my personal belief, is that if, for example, Patty said, wait a minute, we can't have divers on a deep course diving to 130 feet. We're going to shallow them up for safety to 110 feet. Well, their feeling is if I tell people they can only dive to 110 feet, they're going to say to hell with Patty. They're going to go to SSI or SDI or GUI or RAID or INTD or whatever, because they'll let them go to 130 feet. So nobody wants to be the first one to jump on that. And the agencies, they play well nicely together, but they don't play well nicely together. So getting them all to agree is like getting Biden and Trump to agree to something, right? They just ain't gonna happen, right? So it's something out there. So like I said, I've been working with Dan on this, and I actually wrote an article for them as well as for RAID and a GUI on that. So I've been published by all three of those on my information. And all I've done is pulling information from Simon and several other premier bariologists on this as well, and putting all this information together into one place, right? So it's not my information. I'm just pulling the research from several different places and saying, oh, hey, we need to be aware of this. So I'm working on SSI diligently on that. They're slow to move, but they agree that something needs to happen on this as well.
That's pretty cool. I would definitely agree. That's something I didn't realize and had no idea about. You explained it really well, and it was super helpful.
Good. There's a lot to it. It's a big subject when you start getting into gas density, but at least covering it simply, I think, helps.
Well, and your calculator, that's like super cool because that makes things simple. Also lays out the calculations and allows you. I feel like some of those calculations are pretty great and helps you understand to be a better, safer diver.
It was interesting. Building this spreadsheet probably taught me more than three of the papers put together, because I had to take and figure out the formula and then understand it and then put it together simply so that Excel would understand it. It was making that spreadsheet was extremely helpful for me. That's for sure. So I'm happy to share it. And like I said, at the end of this class, if you guys would like me to share my spreadsheet with you, I'm happy to do so.
Yeah, we both love that.
I'm a spreadsheet and numbers guy.
Yeah, I learned the same thing when I was building my own spreadsheets. It feels like you learn a lot more about that kind of things, and the formulas really able to process and understanding helps more when you're in that setting. So
absolutely. Well, cool. Anything else that interesting stood out today?
At the moment, my brain's kind of overwhelmed. So
a little bit like drinking from a fire hose.
Yep.
Well, good and bad. I'm hoping I'm breaking it down into simple. Here's where you use this. Here's why we use it, and so that it sticks a little bit deeper.
No, it was good. Like it was really good. The thing is like right now I don't even know what to think. But if you know that when you start bringing up subject, you start thinking about stuff. It's like, oh yeah, that sounds familiar. Oh yeah, I know that. Oh yeah, I know this.
Absolutely.
It's just being put on the spot, thinking of specific things. I'm like, yeah, I got nothing.
As SSI says, comfort through repetition.
Yep.
So we'll keep going through it, and we'll get there together. Well, guys, thank you so much. Anything else I can help with tonight?
I don't think so.
Awesome. If you think of anything, don't be afraid to text, write, email, call, whatever. I'm happy to answer whatever. Nikki and I are leaving for Yellowstone on Friday morning early. So if you think about something after the classes on Friday morning and I don't answer for some reason, just leave a voicemail or text. I will get back to you. I promise. So
cool. Is Firehole going to open up again?
Firehole is not open again this year. At least not at this point. And apparently half the steps are now missing, and the whole area where people used to jump into is overgrown with growth. So you can't even tell it was there.
That's figures. That was something I wanted.
It's been closed for 3 years now. This will be the 4th year.
Yeah, ever since COVID.
Yep. So they've used all kinds of excuses. I just talked to the Rangers. I'm going to end the recording. We don't need